Welcome, we're so happy you tuned in tonight. Before we get started, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Now, let's get comfortable and drift into deep, peaceful sleep together. The next story is about to begin, please relax and enjoy. Marcus Chen had always been the quiet one in his junior class, the kid who preferred ancient history documentaries to video games, who could recite Roman emperors in chronological order, but struggled to remember what he'd eaten for breakfast. So when Mrs. Davidson announced their field trip to the Metropolitan Museum's new Roman exhibition, he was the first to sign up and the last to complain when the bus broke down, extending their visit by 3 hours. While his classmates clustered around the interactive displays, snapping selfies with marble statues and complaining about the smell of old stone, Marcus found himself drawn deeper into the quieter sections of the exhibit. The afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across glass cases filled with ancient weapons, jewellery and pottery. He moved methodically from display to display, reading every placard, studying every artefact as if it might reveal some secret the museum curators had missed. It was in the farthest corner of the Roman military section that he found it, a bronze helmet, its surface green with age and marked by a spiderweb of hairline cracks that seemed to pulse in the shifting light. Unlike the other pristine artefacts, this one looked battle-worn, authentic in a way that made his chest tighten with inexplicable recognition. The placard read, "Gladiator's Helmet, circa 80 CE, origin unknown, recently acquired from a private collection. Note the unusual bronze composition and mysterious inscriptions along the crown." Marcus pressed closer to the glass, his breath fogging the surface. The helmet seemed to call to him, and without fully realising what he was doing, he found his hand reaching out. The security guard was distracted, helping an elderly visitor, and the case's motion sensors had been acting up all day according to the maintenance worker he'd overheard earlier. His fingertips touched the cool bronze and the world exploded. The museum floor tilted, the walls spun like a carnival ride, and a sound like thunder filled his ears. Colours bled together. The white of marble statues, the gold of Roman coins, the red of painted frescoes, all swirling into a vortex that pulled him down, down, down into darkness. When consciousness returned, it came with the taste of dust and the smell of human sweat mixed with animal waste. Marcus groaned, his head pounding as he tried to focus his eyes. Stone walls surrounded him, rough-hewn and stained with what looked like old blood. Straw covered the floor, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the clash of metal on metal, punctuated by shouted commands in a language he somehow understood but knew he shouldn't. Latin. They were speaking Latin. He sat up slowly, his modern clothes, jeans, sneakers, and a New York Giants hoodie, completely out of place in what appeared to be some sort of cell. The bronze helmet sat beside him, no longer cracked but gleaming as if freshly forged, somehow attached to his backpack by leather cords that definitely hadn't been there before. By Jupiter's beard! What manner of slave is this? The voice boomed from the cell's entrance, where a massive Roman soldier stood studying him with suspicious eyes. 2 more soldiers flanked him, their armour catching the torchlight that flickered from sconces along the corridor beyond. Marcus scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I'm not a slave," he said, then realised he'd spoken in Latin without thinking. How was that possible? The lead soldier laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the stone walls. "Not a slave? Then explain your strange garments and that sacred helmet of Mercurius. You're either a runaway gladiator or a very poor thief." He gestured to the other soldiers. "Bring him to Dr. Brutus. If he's a fighter, he'll earn his keep. If not..." He shrugged, the implication clear. They dragged him through a maze of corridors that opened into a vast training ground under the open sky. The Ludus Magnus, his history-obsessed brain supplied automatically. The great gladiator school of Rome. Sand covered the practice area, darkened in patches with old blood, and wooden weapons lined the walls. Dozens of men moved through combat drills, their bodies scarred and muscled, their eyes holding the flat wariness of those who lived each day knowing it might be their last. At the centre of it all stood a man who could only be Dr. Brutus. Tall, lean, with arms like iron bands and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. A long scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, and when he smiled at Marcus's approach, it was the expression of a wolf sizing up prey. "Another gift from our generous patron," Brutus said, circling Marcus like a predator. "What fighting experience do you have, boy?" "Fighting experience?" Marcus's voice cracked. I don't fight. I'm a student. There's been some kind of mistake." Brutus backhanded him casually, the blow sending Marcus sprawling into the sand. Blood filled his mouth, and his vision blurred. "Everyone fights here," Brutus said conversationally. "The only question is whether you fight well enough to live through tomorrow." He nudged Marcus with his foot. "Get up. Let's see what you're made of." The next few hours passed in a haze of pain and confusion. They thrust wooden weapons into his hands, first a gladius, then a spear, then a net and trident combination that nearly tangled him into unconsciousness. Each time he failed to meet Brutus's standards, which seemed to involve not dying immediately, the doctor would demonstrate the proper technique by beating Marcus with ruthless efficiency. "You move like a city boy," Brutus observed after Marcus had failed to block a simple sword thrust for the dozenth time. "Soft hands, soft mind. But..." He tilted his head, studying Marcus with new interest. "You learn quickly, and you see attacks before they come. Interesting." It was true, Marcus realized with surprise. After the initial shock wore off, some survival instinct had kicked in. He found himself anticipating Brutus's moves, not through skill but through pattern recognition. The same ability that helped him ace history tests was letting him read the subtle tells that preceded each attack. It wasn't enough to make him competent, but it was enough to keep him breathing. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the training ground, another gladiator approached their practice area. He was young, maybe 20, with the pale complexion and blue eyes of someone from the Northern Territories. Scars crisscrossed his arms and torso, but his movements held a fluid grace that spoke of years of training. "Doctore," the young man said, bowing slightly, "I am Gaius Valerius Maximus, though the men call me Valerius." "I heard you had a new recruit," Brutus grunted, "if you can call him that." "Darius, this is Valerius. He'll show you to your quarters and explain the rules. Try not to get yourself killed before your first real fight. I've got money riding on you lasting at least a week." Valerius helped Marcus to his feet, his grip strong but gentle. "Come," he said quietly. "You look ready to collapse." The gladiator quarters were sparse but clean. Long barracks lined with simple beds, each man's possessions limited to what could fit in a small wooden chest. Valerius led him to an empty bed near the back, away from the clusters of men who watched their arrival with calculating eyes. "You're not what they think you are," Valerius said once they were alone. It wasn't a question. Marcus considered lying, then decided on a version of the truth. "I'm lost. I don't know how I got here, and I don't know how to get home. And the helmet..." Marcus touched the bronze artifact still secured to his pack. Up close, he could see the inscriptions the museum placard had mentioned. Symbols that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. "I found it. Or it found me. I think it's connected to why I'm here." Valerius nodded slowly. "The men have been talking about it. They say it's the helmet of Mercurius, that it brings victory to whoever wears it in the arena. The last man who owned it won 12 fights in a row before he earned his freedom." "What happened to him?" "He tried to leave Rome. They found him 3 days later with his throat cut." Valerius's expression was grim. Freedom is rarely what they promise us it will be. Over the following days, Marcus learned the brutal rhythm of gladiator life. Dawn brought training, endless hours of sword work, spear fighting, and hand-to-hand combat that left his muscles screaming and his hands raw despite the cloth wrappings they gave him. Midday meant rest, food, and medical attention for the inevitable injuries. Afternoons brought more training, this time focused on specific fighting styles and arena tactics. The other gladiators remained suspicious of him, but Valerius proved to be a patient teacher, and gradually a friend. He'd been captured during a raid on his village in Gaul 3 years earlier, and unlike many of the others who'd been broken by their circumstances, he maintained a quiet dignity and a stubborn hope that someday he'd see his homeland again. "The trick," he told Marcus one evening as they tended to their wounds, "is to remember who you were before this place tried to remake you. The moment you forget that, you become just another animal fighting for scraps." But not everyone was as accepting as Valerius. A gladiator named Quintus, a bull of a man with arms like tree trunks and a disposition to match, had taken an immediate dislike to Marcus. Perhaps it was jealousy over the attention the mysterious helmet generated, or maybe it was simple predatory instinct targeting the weakest member of the pack. Whatever the reason, he made Marcus's life miserable with a creativity that would have been impressive if it weren't so vicious. Strange clothes, strange speech, strange weapons, Quintus would mutter just loud enough for others to hear. Mark my words, there's something unnatural about this one. The gods don't favour pretenders. 2 weeks into his captivity, Marcus got his first taste of what waited for him beyond the training ground. They marched the gladiators through underground tunnels that reeked of fear and death. Emerging into the Hippodrome, the vast network of chambers and corridors beneath the Colosseum's arena floor. The sound hit him first. 50,000 voices creating a wall of noise that seemed to press against his chest. Then came the smells: sweat, blood, exotic animals, and the peculiar mixture of perfume and wine that marked the Roman elite in their seats high above. "Remember," Valerius whispered as they waited in the holding area, "the crowd loves a good show more than they love death. Give them drama, make them cheer, and you might live to see another sunset." Marcus's first opponent was a thin man with the hollow eyes of someone who'd already given up. They handed him wooden weapons, training gear that could still kill but was less likely to produce the spectacular arterial sprays that marked the more prestigious matches. His opponent wielded a net and trident, the retiarius fighting style, while Marcus found himself with a gladius and small shield, the basic secutor loadout. The gate lifted, and suddenly he was on the sand, the roar of the crowd crashing over him like a physical force. The Colosseum stretched impossibly high above him, tier upon tier of faces all focused on the small circle of sand where he stood trying not to vomit from terror. His opponent attacked immediately, the trident punching forward with surprising speed. Marcus stumbled backward, muscle memory from his training with Brutus taking over, where conscious thought failed. The net came next, and he barely managed to duck under it, the weights along its edge whistling past his ear. What saved him was his complete lack of formal training. Where an experienced gladiator would have followed predictable patterns, Marcus fought with the desperate creativity of someone who'd never learned the proper way to die. When the trident came again, instead of trying to block it with his shield, he grabbed a handful of sand and flung it at his opponent's eyes. While the man staggered, momentarily blinded, Marcus closed the distance and tackled him to the ground. They wrestled in the sand, the crowd's roar intensifying. Marcus had maybe 15 pounds and definitely several years on his opponent, but the man fought with the viciousness of someone who knew defeat meant death. Fingers clawed at Marcus's eyes, knees drove toward his groin, teeth snapped at any exposed flesh. In the end, it was Marcus's modern sensibilities that won the fight. Where his opponent expected him to go for a killing blow, Marcus instead trapped the man's arm in a wrestling hold he'd learned from YouTube videos, applying pressure until the man's shoulder made a wet popping sound, and he screamed in surrender. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheered the unexpected tactics, others booed what they saw as an unsatisfying conclusion. But Emperor Domitian, presiding over the games from the imperial box, raised his thumb. Mercy. Both fighters would live. As guards led them back to the Hippodrome, Marcus's opponent grabbed his arm with his good hand. "Thank you," he whispered. "My family. They needed me to survive today." That night, back in the Ludus, the other gladiators treated Marcus differently. Not with respect, exactly, but with the acknowledgement that he was no longer just meat waiting to be butchered. He'd proven he could survive, and in their world, that was the only currency that mattered. "You fought smart," Valerius said, helping him clean a cut on his forearm. "But next time they'll give you a real opponent. Someone with skill, not just desperation." Marcus nodded, his hands still shaking from adrenaline. As they talked, he noticed the bronze helmet seemed to glow more brightly than before, the inscriptions more distinct. It was reacting to something. The violence, the crowd's energy, or perhaps his own brush with death. Whatever it was, he could feel it building towards something, like a battery slowly charging. His second fight came 3 weeks later, and this time there was no mercy in the selection. His opponent was Lucius Aurelius, a veteran gladiator with 2 years of arena experience and 17 confirmed kills. Unlike Marcus's first fight, this one was scheduled as a true contest. Real weapons, real consequences, and the clear expectation that only one man would walk away. The night before the fight, Quintus cornered him in the latrines. "Tomorrow you die," the big gladiator said conversationally, "but before you do, I want that helmet. Hand it over now, and I'll make sure your death is quick." "It doesn't work that way," Marcus replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "The helmet chooses its bearer." Quintus laughed. "Superstitious nonsense. It's bronze and leather, nothing more." His hand dropped to the knife at his belt. "Give it to me, or I'll take it from your corpse." Before Marcus could respond, Valerius appeared in the doorway, his own blade already drawn. "Is there a problem here?" The tension stretched between them like a wire about to snap, then Quintus shrugged and backed away. "No problem. We were just discussing tomorrow's entertainment." But Marcus could see the calculation in the man's eyes, the patient hunger of a predator willing to wait for the right moment to strike. The next morning brought the familiar ritual, the march through the tunnels, the growing roar of the crowd, the final moments of preparation in the holding chambers. This time, though, Marcus strapped on the bronze helmet, feeling its weight settle onto his shoulders like destiny itself. Lucius Aurelius was everything Marcus was not. Tall, perfectly muscled, moving with the fluid confidence of someone who'd made killing into an art form. He carried a gladius and large shield, the classic gladiator configuration, and when he looked at Marcus across the arena, his smile held the warmth of winter in Germania. The fight began like a dance, both men circling, testing distance and timing. Aurelius was patient, content to let Marcus make the first mistake, while Marcus tried to apply everything Valerius and Brutus had taught him about reading an opponent. When Aurelius finally attacked, it was with a speed that made Marcus's previous opponent look like he'd been moving through honey. The gladius came in a perfect thrust aimed at Marcus's heart, and only the helmet's strange influence, a kind of premonition that came as a tingling along his scalp, gave him enough warning to twist aside. The blade scored along his ribs, drawing a line of fire that made him gasp, but he managed to get his own sword up in time to block the follow-up cut. The crowd roared its approval. They could sense they were watching a real contest. What followed was the longest 10 minutes of Marcus's life. Aurelius pressed his attack with methodical precision, each strike designed to wear down Marcus's defence until the inevitable killing blow could land. Marcus gave ground steadily, his breathing becoming laboured, his arms starting to burn from the constant defensive work. But something strange was happening. The helmet seemed to be feeding him information, not quite thoughts, but impressions, instincts that had no business being in a 16-year-old's head. He began to see patterns in Aurelius's attacks, to anticipate not just the next strike, but the one after that. When Aurelius overextended on a particularly aggressive thrust, Marcus stepped inside his guard and drove his elbow into the veteran's solar plexus. It was a modern fighting technique, one that no gladiator would expect, and Aurelius doubled over, gasping for air. Marcus could have killed him then, should have killed him, according to the crowd's increasing bloodthirsty chants. Instead, he stepped back, giving Aurelius time to recover, a mistake that nearly cost him everything. The veteran came up from his crouch with a hidden dagger, the blade streaking toward Marcus's throat in a move that would have ended the fight instantly. But the helmet's influence was stronger now, its bronze surface actually glowing in the afternoon sunlight, and Marcus moved with inhuman speed to catch Aurelius's wrist just inches from his neck. They stood locked together for a heartbeat, the dagger trembling between them, and Marcus could see surprise and something like fear in Aurelius's eyes. Then Marcus twisted, using leverage instead of strength, and the dagger went spinning across the sand. This time he didn't hesitate. His gladius found the gap in Aurelius's armour, sliding between ribs to pierce the man's heart. Aurelius looked down at the blade protruding from his chest, then up at Marcus, and smiled. "Well fought," he whispered, and died. The crowd went insane. Marcus had not just beaten a veteran gladiator, he'd done it with style, with drama, with the kind of unexpected reversals that made for legendary arena stories. Coins rained down from the stands, and somewhere in the imperial box Emperor Domitian was nodding his approval. But Marcus barely heard any of it. The helmet was singing in his mind now, its bronze surface blazing with an inner fire that he could feel, but that somehow didn't burn him. power flowed through it. Not just the energy of the crowd's adulation, but something deeper, older, connected to forces that existed long before Rome rose from the Seven Hills. That night, back in the gladiator quarters, the celebration was muted by the reality of their situation. Aurelius had been well liked, and his death cast a shadow over what should have been a victory feast. "You're changing," Valerius observed as they sat apart from the others. "The helmet, it's doing something to you." Marcus touched the bronze artifact, which had returned to its normal appearance but still hummed with latent energy. "I can feel it building towards something. Each fight, each moment of danger, it gets stronger. And what happens when it reaches full strength? I think it takes me home." Marcus looked around the torchlit barracks, at the scarred men who'd become his unlikely family, and felt a pang of guilt. "I think it always takes me home." But Quintus had been listening from the shadows, and that night, when the others slept, he made his move. Marcus woke to the sensation of the helmet being lifted from beside his bed, and opened his eyes to see Quintus's bulk silhouetted against the dim light from the corridor. The big gladiator moved with surprising stealth for his size, but the helmet's absence had broken whatever spell of sleep Marcus had been under. "I warned you," Quintus whispered, when he realised Marcus was awake. "It should have been mine from the beginning." Marcus rolled off his bed, coming to his feet in a crouch, but Quintus was already moving toward the exit. The other gladiators stirred but didn't wake. Exhaustion was a constant companion in the ludus, and they'd learned to sleep through minor disturbances. Chase or let it go. The smart choice was clear. Quintus was bigger, stronger, and armed with the desperate fury of someone who'd finally seen his chance at glory. But without the helmet, Marcus was just another piece of meat in the arena. And more than that, the artifact had become his anchor, his only connection to home and the life he'd been torn away from. He followed Quintus through the dark corridors of the ludus, moving as quietly as he could on bare feet. The big gladiator was heading for the arena, probably hoping to claim the helmet's power in the place where it would be strongest. Marcus caught up with him just as he was entering the tunnel system beneath the Colosseum. "Give it back," Marcus called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Quintus turned, the helmet clutched against his chest like a trophy. In the torchlight, his face looked wild, desperate. "I've been fighting for 3 years," he snarled. 3 years of blood and pain and watching lesser men win glory that should have been mine. This is my chance." "It doesn't work that way," Marcus said, edging closer. "The helmet, it's not just about victory. There's something else. Something connected to—" Quintus's roar cut him off, and suddenly the big man was charging, using the helmet like a shield, while his other hand drew a gladius from his belt. Marcus dove aside, rolling across the stone floor as the blade sparked off the wall where his head had been. They fought through the labyrinthine passages beneath the arena, a desperate running battle lit by flickering torches and echoing with the sounds of their breathing and the ring of metal on stone. Quintus had the advantages of size and strength, but Marcus was faster and more familiar with fighting in confined spaces, a skill he'd never imagined he'd need in his suburban New Jersey life. The chase led them up through the beast pens, where the exotic animals destined for tomorrow's games paced in their cages. A tiger snarled as they ran past. Somewhere in the darkness, a lion coughed like thunder. The animal handlers had fled at the first sounds of combat, leaving Marcus and Quintus alone with creatures that could smell blood and fear with predatory accuracy. "You can't escape!" Quintus shouted, his voice ragged with exertion. "I know these tunnels better than you know your own dreams." It was probably true, but Marcus had something Quintus didn't. The helmet's influence, even at a distance, still provided him with flashes of insight, premonitions of danger that kept him one step ahead of his pursuer. When Quintus tried to ambush him in the weapons storage area, Marcus sensed the attack coming and rolled aside just as the gladius punched through the space where he'd been standing. The fight moved into the arena proper, emerging from the hippodrome into the vast oval of sand under the star-filled Roman sky. Without the crowd, the Colosseum felt impossibly large, empty, haunted by the ghosts of all who'd died there. The sand was still dark in places with dried blood from the day's games, and the weapons and shields scattered around the arena's edge gleamed in the moonlight. Quintus had grabbed a shield to go with his sword, making him a formidable opponent even without the helmet's power. Marcus armed himself with a trident and net, the retiarius configuration he'd faced in his first fight, and they began to circle each other on the blood-soaked sand. "Last chance," Quintus called out. "Surrender now and I'll make it quick." Instead of answering, Marcus cast his net, the weighted edges spreading wide as it flew through the air. Quintus knocked it aside with his shield, but it bought Marcus the second he needed to close distance with his trident. They fought under the stars, their battle witnessed only by the marble statues of emperors and gods that looked down from the arena's walls. Quintus was the better swordsman, but Marcus had desperation on his side, and more importantly, he could feel the helmet calling to him, its power growing stronger as violence filled the space around it. The turning point came when Quintus overcommitted to an attack, swinging his gladius in a wide arc that would have taken Marcus's head off if it had connected. Instead, Marcus ducked under the blade and drove his trident forward, its 3 prongs punching through Quintus's shield and into the arm that held it. Quintus screamed and dropped the shield, but instead of pressing his advantage, he threw the helmet as hard as he could toward the far side of the arena. "If I can't have it," he snarled, "then no one can!" The bronze artifact tumbled through the air, catching starlight on its polished surface, and landed in the sand near the arena's eastern wall. Both men ran for it, but Quintus had longer legs and less distance to cover. He reached the helmet first, scooping it up and placing it on his head with a triumphant laugh. "Now," he said, turning to face Marcus with the gladius ready in his good hand, "let's see what victory tastes like." The helmet blazed to life on his head, its bronze surface glowing like a small sun, and Marcus felt his heart sink. Whatever power the artifact possessed, Quintus now commanded it. But something was wrong. Instead of the confident smile Marcus expected, Quintus's face showed confusion, then alarm, then outright terror. The helmet's glow was intensifying, and Marcus could see that it was burning the big gladiator, the bronze somehow heating to unbearable temperatures against his skull. "Get it off!" Quintus screamed, clawing at the helmet with both hands. "Get it off me!" But the artifact wouldn't come free. It had fused itself to his head, and the more he struggled, the brighter it glowed. Marcus could smell burning flesh now, could see smoke rising from where the bronze met skin. "It chooses its bearer," Marcus said softly, remembering what he'd told Quintus earlier. "You can't just take it." Quintus fell to his knees, his screams echoing off the arena walls. The helmet's glow was blinding now, and Marcus had to shield his eyes as he approached the writhing figure. When the light finally faded, Quintus was dead, the helmet resting innocuously in the sand beside his burned corpse. Marcus picked it up carefully, expecting it to be hot, but the bronze was cool to the touch, almost soothing against his palms. He placed it on his head, feeling the familiar weight settle around his temples, and immediately the world shifted into sharper focus. He could sense things, movements in the darkness beyond the arena, the rhythm of sleeping hearts in the ludus, the vast presence of Rome itself sprawling endlessly in all directions. And something else, a pulling sensation, gentle but insistent, tugging at the edges of his consciousness like a tide that was just beginning to turn. The helmet was ready. It had absorbed enough violence, enough blood, enough desperate human emotion to power whatever temporal mechanism had brought him here. All it needed was one more push, one final moment of absolute peril to complete the circuit and carry him home. Above him, torches appeared along the arena's walls as guards responded to the sounds of fighting. Soon they'd be down on the sand, and there would be questions he couldn't answer, suspicions he couldn't allay. He had perhaps minutes before his window of opportunity closed forever. Marcus looked down at Quintus's body, at the peaceful expression death had given him, and felt an unexpected pang of sorrow. The man had been brutal, yes, but he'd also been trapped in the same system that had claimed so many others, slaves, criminals, and conquered peoples, all ground up in the machinery of Roman entertainment. "I'm sorry," he said to the corpse, and meant it. Then he picked up Quintus's fallen gladius and held it to his own throat. The blade was sharp enough to part skin with just the slightest pressure, and a drop of blood ran down his neck as he pressed the edge against his carotid artery. This was the moment the helmet had been waiting for. Not just violence, but the absolute certainty of death, the crystalline instant when life balanced on a razor's edge. The world exploded into light. Reality folded in on itself like origami made of pure energy, and Marcus felt himself pulled through dimensions that had no names, across distances that couldn't be measured in any earthly units. The Colosseum vanished, ancient Rome disappeared, and for a timeless moment he floated in a space between spaces, where the only constants were his own consciousness and the bronze helmet that anchored him to himself. Then the museum floor was solid beneath his feet, and he was standing exactly where he'd been when this impossible journey began, in front of the glass display case, staring at the cracked bronze helmet that looked exactly as it had before, almost exactly. Marcus stumbled backward, his legs suddenly unsteady, and realised he was still wearing the helmet. But even as he watched, it began to change, the bright bronze tarnishing and developing the same green patina and hairline cracks as the museum piece. Within seconds, it was indistinguishable from the artefact in the display case, except that one was in his hands and the other was behind glass. He looked around frantically, expecting to see security guards rushing toward him, but the museum was exactly as he'd left it. Mrs. Davidson was still discussing Roman architecture with a group of students near the front entrance. His classmates were still taking selfies with marble statues. No time seemed to have passed at all, but when he looked down at himself, the evidence of his impossible adventure was written across his body. Sand filled his shoes, not the fine, clean sand of a modern beach, but the coarse, blood-dark sand of an arena floor. His clothes were torn in places he didn't remember tearing them, and beneath the New York Giants hoodie, fresh scars traced the paths where Roman steel had found its mark. Most convincing of all was what he pulled from his pocket, a silver denarius bearing the profile of Emperor Domitian, minted in the year 81 CE according to the inscription around the edge. The coin was real, authentic, valuable enough to fund his college education if he chose to sell it, but he wouldn't sell it, just like he wouldn't tell anyone where he'd been or what he'd seen. Who would believe him? And more importantly, some experiences were too profound to be reduced to mere stories. Marcus carefully placed the helmet he'd brought back into his backpack, then turned away from the display case. As he walked toward the museum exit, he could feel the bronze artifact's weight against his back. Not heavy, but significant, like carrying a piece of history that was also a piece of himself. Outside, the afternoon sun felt different on his skin. Warmer, more precious, laden with the knowledge that each moment of peace was a gift that could be snatched away without warning. He'd lived through humanity at its most brutal and most noble, had seen the courage and cruelty that dwelt side by side in the human heart, and somehow survived to carry that knowledge home. The bus was fixed by the time he rejoined his classmates, and the ride back to school passed in a blur of familiar suburban landscapes that looked impossibly green and clean after the dust and stones of ancient Rome. His friends chattered about the exhibits they'd seen, complained about the length of the trip, made plans for the weekend that stretched ahead of them like an unlimited horizon. Marcus listened to it all with the patient attention of someone who had learned not to take ordinary moments for granted. In his backpack, the bronze helmet rested quietly, its power spent but its presence still comforting. He was home, but he was also forever changed. A modern teenager who carried the memories of a gladiator, a survivor who had learned the true weight of both victory and mercy. That night, alone in his room, he took the helmet out and held it up to the light from his desk lamp. The inscriptions along its crown were visible again, the mysterious symbols that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. But now he thought he understood what they meant, or at least, what they represented. They were a promise and a warning, written in a language older than Latin, older than Greek, older perhaps than human civilization itself. They spoke of the doors that existed between moments, the paths that connected all times and places for those brave enough, or foolish enough, to walk them. Marcus placed the helmet carefully in the back of his closet, behind winter clothes that wouldn't be needed for months. Someday, maybe, he'd be ready to wear it again. But for now, he was content to be exactly where and when he was, a 16-year-old boy in 21st century America, with homework to do and a life to live and all the time in the world to figure out who he wanted to become. Outside his window, the suburban night was peaceful and predictable, filled with the gentle sounds of a world that had never known the roar of 50,000 voices calling for blood. But in the darkness of his closet, the bronze helmet waited with infinite patience, holding within its cracked surface the echoes of distant thunder and the promise of adventures yet to come. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The wooden door groaned against Maya's shoulder as she pushed it open, hinges protesting with a rusty screech that echoed through the abandoned saint. Bartholomew's Church. Moonlight filtered through the broken stained glass windows, casting fractured rainbows across the dust-covered pews and rotting floorboards. The air hung thick with decay and something else, something ancient that made the hair on her arm stand on end. "This place gives me the creeps," whispered Jenna, her voice barely audible as she clutched her phone's flashlight with trembling fingers. The white beam danced nervously across the walls, revealing peeling paint and graffiti left by decades of trespassers. "Don't be such a baby," Derek laughed, though his voice cracked slightly. "It's just an old church. Been empty since the 50s. He kicked at a loose floorboard, sending a shower of splinters across the aisle. "My dad said they found some kind of historical stuff in here when they were going to tear it down. That's why they left it standing." Maya stepped deeper into the sanctuary, drawn by something she couldn't name. The altar stood at the far end, draped in shadows that seemed to move independently of their flashlights. Her sneakers squeaked against the warped wood with each step, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. "Look at all this graffiti," said Alex, running his fingers along carved initials and spray-painted tags. "Some of this stuff looks really old, like colonial old." He pointed to a section of wall where someone had scratched what looked like Latin phrases into the wood. "Weird words here. Ignis temporis porta or something." "Probably just some pretentious college kids," Maya replied, but her eyes were fixed on the altar now. Something was wrong with the shadows there. They seemed too deep, too solid. As she approached, her friends' voices faded to a dull murmur behind her. The altar was carved from dark wood, its surface scarred by centuries of use and abandonment. But what caught Maya's attention was the single object that sat in its centre, a thick white candle, maybe 8 inches tall, sitting in a tarnished brass holder. Unlike everything else in the church, it looked untouched by time or decay. The wax was pristine, almost luminous in the dim light. "Guys, look at this," she called, her voice echoing strangely in the space. "This candle looks brand new." Her friends gathered around the altar, their flashlight beams converging on the mysterious object. Up close, they could see that the candle wasn't entirely white. Threads of silver seemed to run through it like veins, and the wick was unusually long and black. "That's impossible," Jenna said, leaning closer. "Everything else in here is covered in dust and grime. How is that thing so clean?" "Maybe someone comes here regularly," suggested Alex. "Like to pray or whatever," Derek snorted. "In this dump. More likely some homeless guy uses it for light." He reached toward the candle, but Maya grabbed his wrist. "Don't touch it." "Why not?" "It's just a candle." But even as he said it, Derek pulled his hand back. Something about the object made him deeply uncomfortable, though he couldn't say why. Maya stared at the candle, transfixed. The silver thread seemed to pulse in the beam of her flashlight, and she could swear she heard something. A faint humming, like electricity running through wires. "There's something written on the base," she said, pointing to the brass holder. Tiny words were engraved around its circumference, but they were too small and tarnished to read clearly. "Come on, let's get out of here," Jenna said, backing away from the altar. "This whole place feels wrong, like we're not supposed to be here." "We're not supposed to be anywhere we go," Derek said with a nervous laugh. "That's what makes it fun, right?" But Maya barely heard them. The humming was getting louder, and the silver threads in the candle were definitely moving now, swirling like liquid mercury trapped in wax. Her hand moved toward her pocket, where she kept the lighter she'd stolen from her mum's purse. "Maya?" Alex's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You okay?" She pulled out the lighter, its cheap plastic warm in her palm. "I want to light it," she said, the words coming from somewhere deep inside her, unbidden. "That's probably not a good idea," Jenna said. "What if it's some kind of memorial or something? What if someone cares about it?" "What if it burns the whole place down?" added Alex. "These old buildings go up like matchsticks." But Maya was already flicking the lighter, the small flame casting dancing shadows on her face. "I have to," she said, though she couldn't explain why. The compulsion was overwhelming, like an itch she couldn't scratch. "I have to see what happens." "Maya, no!" Derek reached for her, but it was too late. She touched the flame to the wick and the candle ignited instantly. But this wasn't the warm, gentle glow of ordinary fire. The flame burned white-hot and perfectly still, casting no shadows. The moment it caught, the temperature in the church plummeted. Frost began forming on the windows and their breath misted in the suddenly frigid air. "What the hell?" Derek started, but his words were cut off by a sound like breaking glass. Cracks appeared in the air itself, spider webbing out from the candle in all directions. Through the fissures, Maya could see something else. Not the moonlit cemetery outside, but rolling fields under a grey sky. The walls of the church began to shimmer and fade, becoming translucent. The pews dissolved like smoke, and the graffitied walls peeled away in layers, revealing rough stone beneath. The modern world was falling apart around them, replaced by something older and far more sinister. "Run!" shouted Alex, but when Maya tried to move, she found her feet rooted to the floor. The candle was stuck fast in her hand, the flame burning cold against her palm without singeing her skin. Her friends' terrified faces grew distant and warped, as if she was seeing them through water. The humming became a roar, and then everything went black. Maya woke to the sound of hushed voices speaking in accents she didn't recognize. Her head throbbed, and every breath felt like swallowing ice. Slowly she opened her eyes and found herself lying on packed dirt, surrounded by a crowd of people dressed in dark, simple clothing. The women wore white caps over their hair, and the men had wide-brimmed hats and severe expressions. She sat up, confused and disoriented, still clutching the lit candle in her right hand. The flame burned just as it had in the church, white and motionless, casting that strange, shadowless light. But everything else was wrong, terribly wrong. The church was gone. In its place stood a simple wooden meeting house with plain walls and narrow windows. The cemetery outside was smaller, with rough headstones and wooden crosses instead of the elaborate monuments she remembered. The trees were different too, smaller, younger, as if the entire landscape had been rolled back in time. "She bears the devil's light," whispered an elderly woman, pointing at the candle with a gnarled finger. "Look how it burns without consuming itself." Maya looked down at the candle in confusion. The woman was right. Despite burning brightly, the wax showed no signs of melting or shortening. It was exactly the same size as when she'd first lit it. "What? Where am I?" Maya asked, her voice hoarse. The crowd stepped back as if her words themselves were dangerous. "Salem Village," said a stern man with a dark beard, stepping forward from the group. He wore the plain black coat and white collar of a Puritan minister. "And you, child, have much to answer for. Thomas Putnam saw you appear from thin air in the devil's own fire. The whole village witnessed your unholy arrival. Salem Village." Maya's blood went cold. She knew that name from history class, from stories that had given her nightmares as a child. Salem Village, 1692, the witch trials. "That's impossible," she said, struggling to her feet. Several people in the crowd gasped and made the sign of the cross. "I was just in the church with my friends. We were exploring, and I lit this candle and then—" She trailed off, looking around at the faces surrounding her. They were all wrong, too thin, too hard, marked by lives of brutal labour and constant fear. And their clothes, their speech, everything about them screamed of a different century. "Your friends?" The minister's eyes narrowed. "What friends?" "You appeared alone in a pillar of flame, wearing the devil's own garments." He gestured at her clothing, jeans, sneakers, and a hoodie that must have looked bizarre and frightening to people who had never seen anything like them. Maya looked down at herself and realised how she must appear to them. Her clothes were made of materials that wouldn't be invented for centuries, cut in styles that would seem indecent and alien to Puritan sensibilities. Her sneakers alone probably looked like the work of demons. "I'm not a witch," she said desperately. "I'm just a girl. A normal girl. I don't know how I got here." "The devil's servants always claim innocence," said a woman in the crowd. "But the evidence speaks for itself. That unholy flame, those strange garments, the way you appeared from nothing. What more proof do we need?" The minister held up his hand for silence. "I am Reverend Samuel Parris," he said solemnly. "By the authority vested in me by the magistrates of this colony, I place you under arrest for the practice of witchcraft and congress with Satan. You will be held until proper examination can be conducted." "No, you don't understand," Maya began, but rough hands seized her arms. The candle remained firmly gripped in her right hand, the flame continuing to burn with that eerie, unchanging light. "The demon fire will not be extinguished," someone called out. "See how it clings to her hand." Maya tried to drop the candle, but found she couldn't. Her fingers were locked around it as if by some invisible force. The brass holder was neither hot nor cold, it simply was, like an extension of her own body. They dragged her through the village streets, past wooden houses with diamond-paned windows and thatched roofs. Curious faces peered out at the procession, and she heard the word witch whispered over and over like a poisonous prayer. Children ran alongside, pointing and shouting until their mothers pulled them away. The jail was a stone building that squatted at the edge of the village like a malignant growth. Inside it was dark and damp, with cells barely large enough to lie down in. The jailer, a burly man with missing teeth, shoved Maya into one of the cramped spaces and slammed the iron door shut. "Welcome to hell," he said with a cruel grin before walking away. Maya collapsed onto the straw-covered floor, finally allowing herself to break down. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of elaborate hallucination, maybe caused by inhaling mold spores in the old church. But the cold stone against her back felt undeniably real, as did the stench of unwashed bodies and human waste that permeated the jail. She wasn't alone. The cell across from hers held a young woman about her own age, with lank brown hair and hollow, desperate eyes. In the cell to her left, an elderly man sat hunched against the wall, mumbling prayers in a voice-worn roar from screaming. "You're new," said the young woman, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did they accuse you of?" "Witchcraft," Maya replied, then almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "They think I'm a witch because I appeared out of nowhere holding this." She held up the candle, its flame still burning bright and steady. The woman's eyes widened. "Mother of God," she breathed. "That flame, it's been burning this whole time." Maya nodded. "I can't put it out. I can't even let go of it." "Then you really are?" The woman crossed herself and shrank back into the shadows of her cell. "I'm not a witch," Maya snapped. "This is all some kind of mistake. Some kind of impossible accident." The elderly man in the adjacent cell chuckled, a sound devoid of humour. "We all said that at first, girl. But they don't much care about truth here. Only fear." "How long have you been here?" Maya asked. "Months," the woman replied. "I was accused by Abigail Williams herself. She said I sent my spectre to torment her in the night." She laughed bitterly. I'd never seen the girl before in my life, but that matters little. Her word against mine, and she's the niece of Reverend Paris. The old man nodded grimly. "I've been here since spring. My neighbour coveted my land and whispered that he saw me dancing with the devil. Now he tends my crops while I rot in this hole." Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the stone wall surrounding her. These people were going to die. She knew it from her history lessons. Most of the accused would be hanged on Gallows Hill, their bodies left to rot as a warning to others. "There has to be a way out," she said, more to herself than to her fellow prisoners. "There has to be." The old man studied her with sharp, intelligent eyes. "That candle of yours," he said slowly. "There's something otherworldly about it. The flame doesn't flicker, doesn't dance. It burns like it's from somewhere else entirely." Maya looked down at the candle in her hand. He was right. While normal flames would waver and move, this one remained perfectly still, as if painted on the air. "What do you think it means?" "My grandmother was from the old country," the man said, lowering his voice. "She told stories of ancient magics, of objects that could bridge the gap between worlds. She used to say that fire was the first magic, the one that separated man from beast. And sometimes, if the right words were spoken over the right flame—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "What words?" Maya pressed. "I don't remember them all." "But she said fire brought things to our world, and fire could send them back." He fixed Maya with an intense stare. "Fire brought you here, didn't it?" Maya nodded slowly. The moment she'd touched the flame to the wick, reality had shattered around her. Could it be that simple? Could the same fire that had trapped her here also be her way home? But even as the thought occurred to her, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside, heavy boots on stone getting closer. The jailer appeared at her cell door, flanked by 2 magistrates in dark robes. "Time for your examination, witch," he said, producing a ring of iron keys. "The whole town's gathered to see what the devil's newest servant has to say for herself." They hauled Maya out of the cell and through the streets to the meeting house, the same building she'd mistaken for the abandoned church, but now it was alive with activity, packed with villagers eager to witness the interrogation of the mysterious girl who had appeared in flames. Maya was dragged to the front of the room and forced to stand before a table where 3 stern-faced men sat with quills and parchment. Behind them, Reverend Paris watched with cold, calculating eyes. "State your name for the record," commanded the man in the centre, his voice booming through the cramped space. "Maya?" "Maya Chen," she replied, her voice barely audible. A murmur ran through the crowd. Chen was clearly not a name they recognised, confirming their suspicions about her foreign, possibly demonic origins. "Where do you come from?" the magistrate continued. "Millbrook is about 20 miles north of here." Maya knew it was useless. Millbrook wouldn't be founded for another 100 years, but she had to try. "There is no place called Millbrook in this colony," the magistrate said, making a note on his parchment. "Are you perhaps from the dark realm where Satan holds court?" "No. I'm from the future," Maya said desperately. "I know how insane that sounds, but it's true. That candle, it's some kind of portal or gateway. When I lit it, it brought me here from the year 2023. The crowd erupted in shocked gasps and angry shouts. Someone yelled blasphemer, while another voice called for her immediate execution. The magistrate slammed his gavel down repeatedly until the noise subsided. "You claim to have travelled through time using demonic magic?" "Not demonic. I don't know what kind of magic it is, but it's not evil. I'm not evil. I'm just a 16-year-old girl who made a stupid mistake." 16 and already in league with the devil," Reverend Paris said, shaking his head sadly. "How long have you been practicing the dark arts, child?" "I don't practice anything. I don't know any magic at all." Maya's voice was rising to a hysterical pitch. "This is all just a horrible accident." "Then explain the flame that will not die," the magistrate demanded, pointing at the candle still clutched in her hand. "Explain the strange garments you wear, the foreign words you speak." Maya looked down at the candle, and for the first time since lighting it, she noticed something different. The flame was brighter than before, and the silver threads in the wax were moving more rapidly, swirling in complex patterns like a miniature storm. "I don't know," she whispered. "I just don't know." The examination continued for what felt like hours. They asked her about her family, her home, her education, all things that only reinforced their belief in her supernatural origins. How could she explain cars and computers and cell phones to people who had never seen anything more complex than a water wheel? Finally, the magistrates conferred among themselves in low voices before the lead judge stood to address the crowd. "We have heard enough," he announced. "The evidence is overwhelming. This girl admits to using supernatural means to travel through time itself. She bears an unholy flame that refuses to be extinguished. Her very appearance among us was witnessed by dozens of good Christian folk as a manifestation of diabolic power." The crowd was growing restless, their whispers becoming angry mutters. Maya could feel the mood in the room shifting from fearful curiosity to murderous rage. "We find the accused guilty of witchcraft and congress with Satan," the magistrate continued. "She will be held until dawn, when she will be taken to Gallows Hill and hanged by the neck until dead. May God have mercy on her soul." The crowd exploded into cheers and shouts of approval. Maya felt her legs give out, and only the grip of her guards kept her upright. This couldn't be happening. She was going to die in a world 3 centuries before her birth, executed for crimes she'd never committed. As they dragged her back toward the jail, the crowd followed, their voices raised in a chant that made her blood run cold. "Hang the witch! Hang the witch! Hang the witch!" But then Maya noticed something that made her heart race. The candle in her hand was responding to the chant, its flame growing brighter with each repetition. And carved into the doorframe of the meeting house, barely visible in the flickering light, were the same Latin words Alex had read in the abandoned church. Ignis temporis, porta. Fire, time, portal. The door of time through fire. Maya spent her last night in the cell, staring at the candle and trying to remember every detail of what had happened when she'd first lit it. The flame had burned white hot, reality had cracked like glass, and she'd been pulled through to this nightmarish past. The old man in the next cell had been watching her intently. "You figured something out," he said quietly. "I can see it in your face." "Maybe," Maya replied. "Those Latin words you mentioned, did your grandmother ever say ignis temporis porta?" His eyes widened. "Where did you hear that phrase?" "It was carved into the wall of the church where I lit the candle." "What does it mean?" "Fire is the door of time," he whispered. "It was part of the old incantation, the one my grandmother said could open pathways between worlds. But there was more to it. Other words, other conditions that had to be met. What conditions? The old man was quiet for so long that Maya thought he'd fallen asleep. Finally he spoke. The fire had to be lit at a place of power during a moment of great emotion or need, and the one seeking passage had to speak the words with absolute conviction while the flame burned brightest. What were the words? I can only remember fragments. Something about time being a river and fire being the bridge across it. But it has to be said in the old tongue, the language of power. Maya felt tears streaming down her cheeks. Even if she could remember or reconstruct the incantation, what good would it do? She'd be dead by morning, her neck snapped at the end of a rope. Dawn came far too soon. The jailer appeared at her cell with a grim smile, followed by 2 guards and Reverend Paris. "Time to meet your maker, witch," the jailer said, unlocking her cell door. They bound her hands behind her back, though somehow the candle remained fixed in her right palm, its flame still burning steadily, and marched her through the village streets. Word of the execution had spread, and it seemed like the entire population had turned out to watch. Gallows Hill was a low rise at the edge of Salem village, topped by a massive oak tree with a thick branch that extended out over the slope. A rough scaffold had been erected beneath it, complete with a trapdoor and a noose that swayed gently in the morning breeze. Maya was forced up the steps to the platform, where a hooded executioner waited with practised patience. The magistrates read out her crimes once more, their voices carrying across the assembled crowd. When they asked if she had any final words, Maya looked out at the sea of hostile faces and made her decision. She had to try. Even if it killed her, even if it failed, she had to try. "I am not a witch," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I am a daughter of the future, brought here by forces beyond my understanding. But if you must have your blood, then know this. The fire that brought me here will take me home again." The crowd jeered and shouted, but Maya ignored them. She focused on the candle in her bound hands, its flame suddenly blazing brighter than the sun. The Latin words came to her then, not from memory, but from somewhere deeper, as if the candle itself was whispering them in her mind. "Ignis temporis porta," she shouted over the din. "Flammaque mundum dividit duc me domum. Fire that divides worlds, lead me home." The flame roared higher, no longer white, but blazing with all the colours of the spectrum. The crowd stepped back in terror as heat washed over them in waves. The candle was changing, its wax flowing like liquid light while the silver threads expanded into a web of glowing filaments. The executioner moved to put the noose around her neck, but the moment the rope touched her, it burst into flames and crumbled to ash. The wooden platform began to smoke and char beneath her feet. "Stop her!" someone screamed. "The devil is taking his servant!" But it was too late. The fire from the candle was spreading, not destroying, but transforming. Reality wavered like heat shimmer, and through the distortion, Maya could see another world. Her world. The abandoned church, her friends' terrified faces, the familiar shadows of the 21st century. The crowd was in full panic now, running in all directions as the impossible fire spread across the hillside. But Maya barely noticed them. All her attention was focused on the growing portal that was opening in the air around her. With a sound like thunder, the barriers between worlds finally shattered. Maya felt herself falling upward, pulled by forces beyond comprehension, as Salem village dissolved around her like smoke. The last thing she heard was the old man's voice from the jail, somehow carrying across the chaos. "Remember us, child of the future. Remember us, and tell our story." Maya crashed back to consciousness on the cold stone floor of St. Bartholomew's Church. The candle lay beside her, unlit now but still warm to the touch. Her friends were kneeling around her, their faces pale with worry and confusion. "Maya! Oh God, Maya, are you okay?" Jenna was crying, her hands hovering uncertainly over Maya's prone form. "How long was I out?" Maya asked, sitting up slowly. Every muscle in her body ached, and her throat felt raw as if she'd been screaming for hours. "Hours," Derek said, his usual cockiness replaced by genuine concern. "We tried to wake you, but you wouldn't respond. You were, I don't know, somewhere else, talking in your sleep, saying weird stuff about witches and fire." Maya looked around the church, expecting to see some sign of what had happened. Scorch marks, maybe, or evidence of the temporal rift. But everything looked exactly as it had before. The same graffitied walls, the same broken windows, the same dust-covered pews. "We should get you to a hospital," Alex said. "You might have hit your head when you collapsed." "No," Maya said quickly. "I'm fine. Really. I need to go home." They helped her to her feet, and she carefully picked up the candle. It looked ordinary now, just white wax and a blackened wick. But when she turned it over in her hands, her breath caught. The candle had burned down by half, despite never being lit in the present, and there, pressed into the soft wax like a fossil, was the unmistakable shape of a hangman's noose. Her friends saw it too, their faces going pale in the moonlight streaming through the broken windows. "What the hell is that?" Derek whispered. Maya ran her finger over the wax impression, feeling the rough texture of a rope that had existed 3 centuries ago. "A reminder," she said quietly. "A reminder that some stories need to be told." They left the church in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. Maya was the last to leave, pausing at the threshold to look back at the altar where her journey had begun. "I remember," she whispered to the empty air. "I remember all of you." As they walked back through the cemetery toward their cars, Maya pulled out her phone and began typing notes about everything she had experienced. The names of the prisoners, the faces of the accusers, the feel of the rope around her neck. All of it had to be preserved. She'd been given a gift more precious than she could have imagined. The chance to bear witness to history, to carry the stories of the forgotten dead back to the world of the living. Salem Village was gone, erased by time and development, but the people who had lived and died there deserved to be remembered. The candle remained in her backpack as they drove home, its weight a constant reminder of the impossible journey she'd taken. Sometimes, when she wasn't looking directly at it, she could swear the wick glowed faintly in the darkness, as if the fire that had carried her across centuries was still burning somewhere, waiting for the next brave or foolish soul to light it and step through time. Maya never spoke of her experience to her friends or family, but she threw herself into research with a passion that surprised everyone who knew her. She spent hours in the library, poring over historical records and genealogical documents, tracking down the descendants of the people she had met in Salem Village, and late at night, alone in her room, she would hold the candle and feel the weight of their stories in her hands. The old man had been right. She was the child of the future, and she had a responsibility to remember. To tell the truth about Salem, about the fear and madness that had consumed a community and cost so many innocent people their lives. The candle never burned again, but it didn't need to. It had already served its purpose, bridging the gap between past and present, between the living and the dead. And in Maya's careful hands, the stories it had shown her would live on, ensuring that the victims of Salem Village would never be truly forgotten. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind was just right, Maya thought she could hear voices carried on the air, whispers of gratitude from beyond the grave, thanking her for remembering, for caring, for refusing to let their stories die with them. The Salem candle sat on her shelf, a guardian of memories and a keeper of truths too important to be lost to time. And Maya knew that someday, when the moment was right and the need was great enough, it would burn again, carrying another traveller across the impossible distance between what was and what is, adding new chapters to the endless story of human courage in the face of the unknown. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The fluorescent lights of the Metropolitan Museum hummed overhead. As Marcus Chen shuffled along with his 11th grade art history class, their voices echoing off the marble floors. Most of his classmates had already moved on to the next gallery, but something held Marcus transfixed before a massive oil painting titled The Masquerade at Palazzo Medici, 1489. The canvas depicted a grand Renaissance ballroom alive with swirling dancers, their faces hidden behind elaborate masks of silk, feathers, and gold leaf. Candlelight flickered across the painted scene, casting shadows that seemed to dance independently of the figures they belonged to. Mrs. Patterson's voice drifted from the next room, explaining the significance of Byzantine mosaics, but Marcus couldn't tear his gaze away from the painting. The longer he stared, the more details emerged from the rich oils. A woman in emerald silk wore a mask shaped like a peacock, its jewelled eyes seeming to follow him. A man in burgundy velvet bore a golden sun face that appeared to pulse with its own light. But it was the figure in the far corner that truly captivated him. A a guest whose silver mask seemed to shimmer and move like liquid mercury, defying the static nature of paint on canvas. Marcus stepped closer, his breath fogging the protective glass. The painting's nameplate read, "Artist Unknown. Commissioned to commemorate Lorenzo de' Medici's spring celebration. Note the mysterious figure in the background, whose identity has puzzled historians for centuries." The mysterious figure, the one with the silver mask, appeared to be looking directly at Marcus, despite being painted over 500 years ago. A strange warmth emanated from the canvas, and Marcus could swear he heard something beneath the museum's ambient noise. Music. Faint at first, but growing stronger, the lilting melody of a lute mingling with the deeper tones of a viola da gamba. The scent of beeswax candles and rose water seemed to drift from the painting, replacing the museum's sterile air conditioning. His reflection in the protective glass began to waver, as if the surface were water rather than solid barrier. The candlelight in the painting definitely flickered now. Not the static representation of flame that should have been there, but actual dancing light. Marcus reached out instinctively, his palm pressing against the glass, and the barrier dissolved beneath his touch like morning mist. The music swelled around him, drums and trumpets joining the strings, and suddenly he was falling forward into warm amber light. His sneakers hit marble with a sharp echo that cut through the music like a blade. Marcus stumbled, catching himself against a carved pillar, and looked up to find himself standing in the very ballroom he'd been studying. The painting's flat perspective had become three-dimensional reality. Torches blazed in iron sconces along walls draped with tapestries depicting hunting scenes and heraldic symbols. The air was thick with the scent of exotic spices, fine wines, and human bodies adorned with costly perfumes. Nobles swept past him in a kaleidoscope of colour and motion. Women in gowns of deep jewel tones, sapphire blue, emerald green, ruby red, their hair adorned with pearls and gold thread. Men in doublets of silk and velvet, their legs encased in fitted hose, daggers gleaming at their sides. Every face was hidden behind a mask. Foxes and wolves, angels and demons, suns and moons, creating a garden of beautiful monsters moving in elaborate patterns across the marble floor. Marcus looked down at himself in horror. His jeans, sneakers and museum gift shop t-shirt might as well have been a neon sign announcing his foreignness. Several masked dancers had already noticed him, their conversations pausing as they turned to stare. A woman in a silver gown and swan mask whispered something to her companion, whose bare mask did nothing to hide his suspicious frown. Before panic could fully set in, a figure materialised at Marcus's elbow, a thin man in servant's livery, his face uncovered and bearing the weathered look of someone accustomed to solving problems quickly and quietly. "My lord," the servant whispered urgently, "you're terribly late. The master will have my head if you're not properly attired." Without waiting for a response, he grasped Marcus's arm and guided him toward an alcove hidden behind a tapestry. "I don't understand," Marcus began, but the servant was already pulling items from a wooden chest, a burgundy doublet rich with gold embroidery, black hose, soft leather boots, and a simple black domino mask. "No time for explanations, my lord. The Medici are about to announce the evening's entertainment, and all guests must be in their places." The servant's hands moved with practised efficiency, helping Marcus out of his modern clothes and into the Renaissance finery. The doublet fit surprisingly well, as if tailored for his frame, and the boots, though foreign to his feet accustomed to rubber soles, were comfortable enough. "But I'm not supposed to be here," Marcus protested, even as the servant tied the mask's silk ribbons behind his head. "None of us are supposed to be anywhere, my lord," the servant replied cryptically. "We are all players in someone else's game tonight. Now go quickly, dance, drink, and keep your wits about you. Not all the masks in this room hide friendly faces." Before Marcus could ask what he meant, the servant had melted back into the crowd, leaving him alone among the swirling dancers. The music, now clearly coming from a group of musicians on a raised platform, was unlike anything he'd heard before. The melodies were complex, interweaving like conversation, sometimes playful, sometimes melancholy, always beautiful. Marcus tried to move naturally, to blend in as the servant had advised, but every step felt precarious. He'd seen movies about time travel, read books about people displaced in history, but the reality was overwhelming. The sensory assault of unfamiliar sights, sounds and smells made it difficult to think clearly, and yet, beneath the fear, excitement buzzed in his veins. This was Renaissance Florence, the beating heart of the artistic and intellectual revolution that had shaped the modern world. As he moved through the crowd, fragments of conversation reached his ears. Most was in Italian, which he couldn't understand, but some was in Latin, which his 2 years of high school study allowed him to partially follow. The speakers seemed to be discussing politics, art and philosophy with equal passion. He heard references to Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent, and realised he was witnessing a gathering hosted by one of history's most famous patrons of the arts. But gradually, Marcus began to notice darker undercurrents in the conversations around him. A man in a wolf mask spoke quietly to another guest about the price of loyalty. A woman whose mask bore the face of Medusa mentioned change is coming sooner than expected. Most troubling, several conversations ceased entirely when he approached, as if his presence triggered some kind of wariness. It was while observing these subtle tensions that Marcus first noticed her, the woman in the silver mask. She stood near a marble fountain in the centre of the hall, seemingly alone despite the crowd around her. Her gown was the colour of moonlight on water, and her mask was exactly as it had appeared in the painting, seeming to shift and flow like liquid mercury. Unlike the other guests who moved in the predictable patterns of formal dance, she remained perfectly still, watching. Marcus felt drawn to her, as if by an invisible thread. He began moving through the crowd in her direction, but found his path blocked by other dancers, servants carrying trays of delicacies, and small groups engaged in intense discussion. Every time he thought he'd found a clear route, someone would step into his way, always seemingly by accident, always with a polite excuse. It was during one of these frustrated attempts to reach the silver-masked woman that Marcus overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. Two men in elaborate masks, one depicting a golden sun, the other a blood-red moon, stood near a pillar, their voices low but audible if one listened carefully. "The blade will be blessed at midnight," the sun-masked man said. "When Lorenzo raises the final toast, that will be our signal. And if he doesn't drink from the poisoned cup, then we proceed with the original plan. The Medici line ends tonight, one way or another." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. He was witnessing the planning of an assassination attempt against one of the most important figures of the Renaissance. Lorenzo de' Medici, patron of Michelangelo, protector of learning and art, was supposed to die tonight. But which Lorenzo? The famous Lorenzo the Magnificent had died in 1492, but there were other members of the family. And what year was this supposed to be? Before he could process this information fully, a hand fell on his shoulder. Marcus spun around to find himself face to face with the silver-masked woman. Up close, her mask was even more extraordinary. It seemed to be made of actual silver, but silver that moved and flowed like living water. Her eyes, visible through the mask's openings, were in startling shade of violet that Marcus was certain didn't occur naturally in humans. "You heard them," she said, her voice carrying the faintest trace of an accent he couldn't identify. "The question is, what will you do about it? I don't understand. Who are you? What is this place?" She smiled, though he could only see it in her eyes. "This place is exactly what it appears to be, a masquerade ball in the Palazzo Medici, spring of 1489. As for who I am..." She paused, tilting her head as if considering her answer. "I am someone who has been waiting a very long time for you to arrive. For me? But I don't belong here. This is impossible. I was in a museum looking at a painting and somehow you stepped through. Yes, I know. The question is whether you're brave enough to step back through when the time comes, or whether you'll lose yourself in the dream like so many others before you." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "Others before me?" The woman gestured subtly toward the crowd around them. "Look carefully at the faces you can see. Look at the servants, the musicians, the dancers whose masks have slipped. How many of them look like they truly belong to this century?" Marcus followed her direction, studying the partially visible faces around him. Now that she'd pointed it out, he could see what she meant. Many of the servants had an oddly modern look about them. Straighter teeth than should have been possible before dentistry, skin that looked too healthy for an age before antibiotics, hair that seemed to have been cut with electric clippers rather than scissors. Even some of the nobles, when their masks shifted or slipped, revealed features that seemed somehow anachronistic. "They're all from other times," he whispered. "The painting is a trap," the woman confirmed. "A beautiful, seductive trap that has been drawing people out of their proper times for centuries. Some come from your era, some from earlier periods, some from times yet to come. All are caught by the allure of Renaissance splendour, the promise of witnessing history firsthand. But you're not trapped. No, I am the guardian, the one who ensures that the trap serves its purpose while preventing it from causing too much damage to the flow of time. And you, Marcus Chen of the 21st century, are here because the painting has finally found someone with the will to break the cycle." The sound of his name spoken aloud in this impossible place sent another shock through Marcus's system. "How do you know my name?" "I know many things. I know you've been drawn to Renaissance art since childhood. I know you've always felt like you were born in the wrong century. I know that when you look at paintings of this era, you feel a longing so deep it's almost painful." Her violet eyes seemed to pierce straight through him. "And I know that unlike the others who have been drawn here, you have the strength to resist the temptation to stay." The music around them shifted to a more urgent tempo, and Marcus noticed the crowd beginning to move in new patterns. At the far end of the hall, a figure in magnificent robes and a simple gold mask had appeared. Clearly someone of great importance, given how the other guests bowed as he passed. "Lorenzo," the woman said, following Marcus's gaze, "and our time grows short. The conspirators are moving into position." Marcus could indeed see the sun and moon-masked men from earlier, along with several others he now suspected of being part of the plot, positioning themselves around the hall. Servants were beginning to circulate with golden cups filled with what looked like wine, but Marcus noticed that certain guests were being offered cups from different trays. "We have to warn him," Marcus said. "Do we?" the woman asked. "Consider carefully. If you prevent Lorenzo's assassination tonight, how might that change history? What ripple effects might that create in your own time?" Marcus felt torn between his instincts and her words. Everything he'd ever read about time travel emphasized the dangers of changing historical events. But could he really stand by and watch someone be murdered, even someone who had been dead for centuries in his own time? "However," the woman continued, "this is not actually your history. This is a reflection of history, a shadow cast by the painting's magic. What happens here affects only this pocket of displaced time, not the real flow of events. The choice is yours, but choose quickly." The decision crystallized in Marcus's mind. Real history or not, he couldn't watch an assassination unfold. He began moving toward Lorenzo, but the crowd seemed to actively resist his progress. Every step forward was met with someone stepping into his path, a servant with a tray blocking his way, a group of dancers whose movements prevented him from passing. Meanwhile, the conspirators were moving with purpose. The man in the sun mask had positioned himself near Lorenzo, a goblet in his hand that gleamed with more than just reflected candlelight. The moon-masked man had drawn close to the musicians, and Marcus realized with growing horror that the signal for the attack was about to be given. "The mask," the woman's voice reached him over the music and crowd noise. "You need the mask." Marcus turned to find her directly behind him, though he hadn't seen her move. In her hands she held a mask unlike any of the others in the room. It was silver like her own, but its surface was perfectly smooth, almost mirror-like, and it seemed to generate its own light. "This mask does not just hide a face," she said, echoing words he remembered from his outline. "It reveals the way home, but more than that, it allows the wearer to move freely through this trapped time, unbound by the constraints that hold the others." Marcus took the mask, surprised by its weight. It felt substantial, real in a way that the rest of this experience somehow didn't. The moment his fingers touched the surface, the sounds around him changed. The music became clearer, the conversations more distinct, and he could suddenly understand the Italian being spoken around him as if it were his native language. More importantly, when he looked around the room, he could see threads of light connecting various figures, golden threads linking those loyal to the Medici, dark red threads binding the conspirators, and silver threads connecting those who, like himself, didn't truly belong to this time and place. "Put it on," the woman urged, "but be warned. Once you wear it, there will be no gradual awakening, no gentle return to your world. When your task here is complete, the transition will be immediate and jarring." Marcus nodded and lifted the mask to his face. The moment it settled into place, the world around him sharpened into crystal clarity. He could see the poison swirling in the wine cup held by the sun-masked conspirator, could hear the whispered countdown of the moon-masked man, could sense the exact moment when the attack would begin. Time seemed to slow as Marcus moved through the crowd. The guests who had been obstacles before now parted before him like water, as if they couldn't quite see him. He reached Lorenzo just as the sun-masked man raised the poisoned goblet in a toast. "To the health and prosperity of the Medici family," the conspirator declared, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet hall. "May they endure forever." Marcus saw the slight emphasis on the word endure, heard the bitter irony in the man's tone, and acted on instinct. As the goblet moved toward Lorenzo's lips, Marcus stepped forward and knocked it from the conspirator's hand. The cup shattered on the marble floor, its contents spreading in a dark stain that seemed to smoke where it touched the stone. Chaos erupted immediately. The conspirators, realizing their plot had been discovered, drew their daggers. Several guests screamed, others began running toward the exits, and the musicians stopped playing with a discordant crash. The sun-masked man lunged at Lorenzo with his blade, but Marcus, still moving with the strange clarity provided by the silver mask, intercepted the attack. The dagger sliced across Marcus's forearm, drawing blood and very real pain, but he managed to grapple with the assassin. Around them, other fights had broken out as the conspiracy unravelled. The moon-masked man was duelling with one of Lorenzo's guards, their swords ringing against each other in the sudden violence. Other conspirators were fleeing or fighting, and the peaceful masquerade had transformed into a battlefield. Marcus had never been in a real fight in his life, let alone a knife fight in Renaissance Italy, but the silver mask seemed to lend him abilities he didn't naturally possess. He could anticipate his opponent's moves, see the telegraphed attacks before they came. When the sun-masked assassin tried to circle around him to get to Lorenzo, Marcus was there first. When the man feinted low and struck high, Marcus had already begun his countermove. The fight couldn't last long. Marcus's borrowed abilities were no match for a trained killer's experience, but it lasted long enough. Lorenzo's guards had finally reached their master and were forming a protective circle around him. Other loyal guests had joined the defence, and the conspirators found themselves outnumbered and outflanked. The sun-masked assassin, realising the attempt had failed, made one final desperate lunge. But instead of targeting Lorenzo, he aimed his blade at Marcus, perhaps recognising that the stranger in the silver mask was the one who had ruined their carefully laid plans. Marcus tried to dodge, but his foot slipped in the spilled wine and poison. He fell backward, the assassin's dagger following him down. Time seemed to slow again, and Marcus saw the blade approaching his heart with perfect, terrible clarity. Then the silver-masked woman was there, moving faster than should have been humanly possible. Her own blade, a stiletto that seemed to be made of the same flowing silver as her mask, intercepted the assassin's dagger just inches from Marcus's chest. The impact sent shock waves through both weapons, and the assassin's blade shattered like glass. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to freeze everyone in the room. The fighting stopped, the screaming ceased, and even the flames in the torches seemed to pause in their flickering. "The game is ended." Marcus looked around and realised that many of the people in the room, guests, servants, even some of the guards, were beginning to fade at the edges, becoming translucent. The elaborate tapestries on the walls were flattening back into painted representations. The three-dimensional reality of the ballroom was slowly reverting to the flat perspective of the museum painting. "It's time to go home," the woman said, helping Marcus to his feet. "All of you." Around the room, the displaced people from various time periods were beginning to move toward the walls, where doorways of light had appeared. Some went reluctantly, looking back at the fading splendour with longing in their eyes. Others seemed relieved, as if awakening from a dream that had become a nightmare. Marcus looked at his arm where the assassin's dagger had cut him. Blood was still flowing from the wound, real and red and painful. "Will this come back with me?" "Proof," the woman said simply. "So that you know it was real, and so that you remember the lesson." "What lesson?" "That the past is beautiful precisely because it is past. That you can appreciate and learn from history without needing to live in it, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is to know when to come home." The ballroom around them was dissolving now, the marble floor becoming flat painted stone, the pillars flattening into brushstrokes. The music was fading back into the museum's ambient hum, and the warm candlelight was being replaced by the cool glow of track lighting. Marcus looked at the silver mask in his hands. It was still solid, still real, still possessed of that strange inner light. What about this? A gift, the woman said, though her own form was beginning to fade along with everything else. And a responsibility. There are other paintings, other traps, other people who need to find their way home. Perhaps someday you'll understand what that means. The last thing Marcus saw before the transformation completed was the woman's violet eyes, visible through her silver mask filled with something that might have been pride or hope or gratitude. Then he was standing in front of the museum painting again, gasping and disoriented. His classmates were still in the next gallery, Mrs. Patterson's voice still droning on about Byzantine mosaics. According to the clock on the wall, only minutes had passed since he'd first stopped in front of the painting, but the painting had changed. The mysterious figure in the silver mask, who had been looking out at the viewer, was now turned slightly away, as if watching the other guests. And in the corner where Marcus had seen the sun-masked conspirator, there was now only empty space, as if the figure had simply vanished from the canvas. Marcus looked down at his hands and found the silver mask still there, though it no longer glowed with its own light. In the museum's fluorescent lighting it looked like an antique theatrical prop, valuable, but not magical. His arm still throbbed where the dagger had cut him, and when he rolled up his sleeve he found a bandage that definitely hadn't been there before. "Marcus!" Mrs. Patterson's voice called from the next room. "Come along, we're moving to the sculpture gallery." Marcus took one last look at the painting, then carefully slipped the silver mask into his backpack. As he turned to go, he could have sworn he heard the faint sound of a lute playing somewhere in the distance. But when he paused to listen, there was nothing but the quiet murmur of museum visitors and the hum of climate control. Walking toward the next gallery, Marcus found his mind racing with questions. Had it really happened? Was the cut on his arm and the mask in his backpack proof, or could there be some other explanation? And what had the woman meant about other paintings, other traps, other people who needed to find their way home? He didn't have answers to those questions, and he suspected he might never have complete answers. But as he rejoined his class and tried to focus on Mrs. Patterson's lecture about marble carving techniques, Marcus found himself looking at the other paintings and sculptures with new eyes. How many of them might be more than they appeared? How many contained worlds waiting to be entered, adventures waiting to be lived, dangers waiting to be faced? And more importantly, how many contained people who had stepped through and never found their way back? The silver mask seemed to grow heavier in his backpack, and Marcus began to understand that his adventure in Renaissance Florence might have been just the beginning of something much larger and more complex. The woman had called the mask a gift and a responsibility. Now, walking through galleries filled with art from every period of human history, Marcus was beginning to grasp what that responsibility might entail. The past was indeed beautiful, because it was past, but sometimes people needed help remembering how to come home to their own time. And sometimes it took someone who had been lost and found their way back to help others do the same. Marcus touched the bandage on his arm through his sleeve and smiled. High school had just become a lot more interesting. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The fluorescent desk lamp cast a harsh circle of light across Maya's cluttered study desk, illuminating scattered notes, empty energy drink cans and the worn leather binding of her grandfather's copy of the Iliad. The digital clock on her laptop glowed 2:47 a.m, and her eyelids felt heavy as lead weights. Another all-nighter for a P-literature, another battle with Homer's endless verses about rage and glory and bronze-tipped spears. She rubbed her eyes and flipped through the yellowed pages, searching for the passage Mrs. Henderson had assigned about Achilles' wrath. The book was ancient, probably older than her parents, with illustrations that seemed more vivid than modern textbooks. Warriors locked in combat, their faces twisted with fury. Ships with black hulls cutting through wine-dark seas. And there, near the end, the massive wooden horse standing before Troy's gates like a monument to deception. Maya's head nodded forward, then snapped back up. She blinked hard and looked down at the page again. The illustration of the Trojan horse seemed different somehow, more detailed than she remembered. The wood grain looked almost real, and she could swear she saw shadows moving in the carved details of the horse's flanks. Must be the exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. She traced her finger along the text, reading Homer's description of the Great Deception. The words seemed to shimmer slightly, as if written in water rather than ink. The battle scene beside it rippled like the surface of a pond disturbed by a thrown stone. Maya leaned closer, squinting at the strange effect. Maybe she needed glasses, or sleep. Definitely sleep. But as her fingertip touched the illustration of the wooden horse, the shimmer intensified. The page grew warm beneath her touch, then hot, then blazing like the surface of a star. Light erupted from the book, not the harsh white of her desk lamp, but something golden and ancient, like sunlight filtered through honey. The world tilted sideways, and Maya felt herself falling forward, not onto her desk, but into the page itself, into the light, into the story. The sensation lasted forever and no time at all. She tumbled through golden radiance that tasted of dust and wine and blood, while phantom voices chanted in languages she'd never heard but somehow understood. Then, with a jolt that knocked the breath from her lungs, she hit solid ground. Maya gasped and pushed herself up on her elbows. Instead of her bedroom carpet, she knelt on stone, rough ancient limestone worn smooth by countless feet. Instead of her desk lamp's harsh glare, warm firelight flickered across towering walls that stretched up into a star-filled sky. Instead of suburban silence, music and laughter and the sound of celebration filled the air. She staggered to her feet, her legs shaking. This wasn't possible. She was dreaming, obviously, had fallen asleep at her desk and was having some elaborate nightmare brought on by too much caffeine and Homer. But the ground felt real beneath her sneakers. The smoky air burned real in her lungs, and the clothes she wore... Maya looked down at herself in horror. Her familiar pyjama pants and oversized hoodie were gone, replaced by a rough woolen tunic that fell to her knees, bound with a cord around her waist. Her feet were bare and already dirty from the ancient stones. She looked like something out of a historical reenactment, or worse, like a slave. "You there," the voice boomed in accented English that her mind somehow translated from ancient Greek. "Stranger." Maya spun around to see 3 Trojan soldiers approaching, their bronze armour gleaming in the firelight. They wore crested helmets and carried spears, and their faces were hard with suspicion. Behind them, she could see the massive gates of Troy standing open, and through them, her blood turned to ice. Rolling through the gates, pulled by dozens of celebrating Trojans, was the wooden horse. It was enormous, easily 20 feet tall, carved with intricate details that made it look almost alive in the dancing torchlight. People danced around it, throwing flowers and singing hymns of victory. They thought the war was over. They thought they'd won. Maya knew better. She'd read this story a dozen times for class. Inside that horse, 30 Greek warriors waited in perfect silence. In a few hours, when Troy slept off its victory celebration, they would emerge and open the gates for their hidden army. By dawn, the greatest city of the ancient world would be ash and rubble. "Seize her," commanded the lead soldier, a scarred veteran with grey threading his beard, another captive from the battlefield by her strange garments. The priest will decide her fate. "Wait!" Maya backed away, raising her hands. I'm not your enemy! I'm not anyone's enemy, But they were already moving. Strong hands grabbed her arms, and despite her struggles, they dragged her through the gates of Troy. She found herself swept along with the celebration, past vendors selling honeyed wine, past children running between the adults' legs, past elderly men arguing about the war's end. Everyone was laughing, singing, drunk on victory and relief. If only they knew. The soldiers hauled her through winding streets lined with houses that rose 3 and 4 stories, their windows glowing with warm light. The architecture was nothing like the ruins she'd seen in textbook photographs. This Troy was alive, vibrant, magnificent. Carved pillars supported elaborate facades, and every surface seemed decorated with paintings of gods and heroes. The smell of roasting meat and spiced wine filled the air, and musicians played lyres and flutes on every corner. They passed the great temple of Athena, where priests in white robes conducted sacrifices of thanksgiving. Maya winced as she saw the altar running red with blood, and one of the priests looked up and caught her eye. He was younger than the others, with intelligent dark eyes and ink-stained fingers. Something in his gaze seemed to recognize her foreignness, her displacement in time. "Here," the lead soldier said, stopping before a modest building near the temple district. The priest Laocoon keeps the foreign captives until they can be properly allocated. You'll stay here tonight." They thrust her through a wooden door into a small dim room lit by oil lamps. Other people sat against the walls, genuine captives from the long war, Maya realised. Women and children mostly, their faces marked by loss and fear. They looked at her with curious eyes, probably wondering what far country she'd been dragged from. The door slammed shut behind her, and Maya sank onto a straw pallet, her mind reeling. This was real. Somehow, impossibly, she was actually in ancient Troy on the night of its destruction. In a few hours, Greek soldiers would emerge from that horse and begin the slaughter she'd read about in Homer's verses. Cassandra's prophecies would prove true. King Priam would die at his own altar. Hector's infant son would be hurled from the walls. The women around her, Maya's stomach lurched. These women and children would be enslaved or killed. Everyone she'd seen celebrating in the streets would be dead by morning. The magnificent city would burn until nothing remained but ruins and legend. She had to warn them. She had to at least try. But how? Who would believe a foreign slave girl claiming to know the future? If she started ranting about Greek soldiers hidden in their victory gift, they'd think her mad. Or worse, they might think her a Greek spy and execute her on the spot. Hours crawled by. Maya dozed fitfully on the straw, jerking awake at every sound. Through the small window she could see the celebration continuing in the streets. People still danced around the great horse, still sang songs of victory. She watched one group of young men climb onto the horse's back, beating drums against its wooden flanks. If only they knew what lay inches beneath their feet. Near midnight, the door creaked open. The young priest from the temple slipped inside, carrying a small oil lamp. He moved quietly between the sleeping captives until he reached Maya's corner. "You're awake," he said softly in Greek. Maya nodded, unsure whether to speak. "I am Antenor," he said. "I serve in Athena's temple, and I have unusual gifts. I can see things that others cannot." His dark eyes studied her face. "You're not from any land I know, are you? Not from any time I know." Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. "What do you mean?" "The gods sometimes send messengers," Antenor said carefully. "Signs and portents, dreams that walk among us in flesh." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You know what comes next, don't you? You've seen the ending of this story." Tears sprang to Maya's eyes. "Yes," she whispered back, "and I don't know how to stop it." Antenor nodded gravely. "Cassandra sees it too, but Apollo's curse ensures no one believes her prophecies, and I suspect your warnings would be met with the same deaf ears." He paused, studying her face. "But perhaps the gods did not send you here to change what must be. Perhaps they sent you for a different purpose." "What purpose?" "To witness, to remember, to carry the truth forward." Antenor reached into his robes and pulled out a small scroll. "Tell me, how did you come to be here? What gate did you pass through?" Maya thought of the book, her grandfather's copy of the Iliad glowing with impossible light. "A door in a story," she said slowly. "Words that became real." Antenor's eyes widened. "Then listen carefully. My grandfather was a priest before me, and his grandfather before him. They passed down certain knowledge, ways of speaking to the gods, old words that hold power." He gripped her hand. "Only the gods who open the gate can close it again. If you came through words, through story, then somewhere in this city lies your path back. But finding it..." He shook his head. "That require courage." A distant sound made them both freeze, the creak of wood and the whisper of rope. Through the window, Maya could see movement around the great horse. Dark figures were sliding down ropes from its belly, armed men dropping silently to the stones. The Greeks had begun their emergence. "It starts," Antenor breathed. "May the gods have mercy on us all." The first scream split the night air, a woman's voice raised in terror. Then another, and another. Torches burst into flame throughout the city as the hidden Greek army opened the gates, and their comrades poured in. The sound of bronze weapons clashing echoed off the stone walls, and smoke began to rise from the first burning buildings. "I have to go," Maya said, scrambling to her feet. "If my way home is connected to how I got here." "The horse," Antenor said, understanding immediately. "But child, the Greeks." "I know." Maya was already moving toward the door. "Thank you." for believing me, for helping me understand. The priest caught her arm. "If you make it back to your own time," he said urgently, "remember us as we were tonight, not just as victims, but as people who lived and loved and hoped. Remember that Troy was beautiful." Maya squeezed his hand. "I will. I promise." She slipped out into chaos. The celebration had transformed into nightmare with horrifying speed. Greek soldiers ran through the streets, some carrying torches to set buildings ablaze, others herding terrified Trojans at spear point. Bodies already littered the stones, men who had tried to resist, women who had tried to protect their children. Maya pressed herself against building walls and crept through the shadows, working her way toward the great square where the horse still stood. The massive wooden structure loomed even larger now, its belly split open like a wound. Ropes dangled from the opening, and she could see torchlight flickering inside its hollow interior. A group of Greek soldiers ran past, chasing a fleeing family. Maya held her breath until they were gone, then sprinted across the open square. The horse's wooden flanks rose above her like the walls of a building. Up close, she could see the incredible craftsmanship, every plank perfectly fitted, every detail carved with artistic precision. It would have been a work of art even without its deadly purpose. She grabbed one of the dangling ropes and hauled herself up, her muscles screaming from the effort. Splinters dug into her palms and the rough rope burned her skin, but she climbed with desperate determination. Behind her, Troy burned. The interior of the horse was larger than she'd expected, hollow and echoing. The Greeks had obviously cleared out completely. She was alone in the wooden belly that had carried the city's doom. But there, in the far corner where shadows gathered deepest, something glowed with familiar golden light. Maya's heart leaped. Her grandfather's copy of the Iliad lay open on the rough wooden floor, its pages rippling with the same liquid light she'd seen in her bedroom. But even as she reached for it, she hesitated. Through the horse's opening, she could see Troy dying. Flames licked at the temple of Athena. Greek soldiers dragged women and children from their homes. In the distance, she glimpsed King Priam himself, the aged ruler of Troy, stumbling through his palace corridors as enemy warriors pursued him with drawn swords. She could save him. Save them all. With the book in her hands, with the power of story itself, surely she could change the ending. Make the Greeks show mercy, prevent the slaughter, rewrite the tragedy into triumph. Maya reached for a fallen sword one of the Greeks had left behind. With this weapon and foreknowledge of their tactics, she could rally the surviving Trojans. She could. The blade crumbled to rust in her hands. She stared at the corroded metal in shock, then understanding dawned. She'd tried to change the story, and the story had rejected her. This was history, not just any history, but the foundation myth of Western literature. It couldn't be altered, not even by someone displaced from time itself. Every attempt to intervene would fail. The gods, as Antenor had said, had sent her to witness, not to change. "Maya!" The voice came from outside, Antenor calling her name as he ran across the square with Greeks in pursuit. "The path home! Take it now!" A spear pierced his back, and the young priest fell face first onto the stones, his blood spread in a dark pool reflecting the flames that consumed his city. Maya sobbed and grabbed the book. The pages felt warm as summer sunlight, and the words seemed to move and shift even as she watched. She flipped to the passage about the Trojan horse, the same illustration she'd touched in her bedroom. It showed the aftermath now. Troy in flames, the horse standing empty, the story complete. But at the bottom of the page, in letters that seemed to write themselves even as she watched, appeared a line that made her heart stop. And the gods bore witness to their tragedy, that none might say these people died in vain. Greek voices shouted outside the horse, footsteps on the ropes. They'd seen the light and were coming to investigate. Maya pressed both palms flat against the page and spoke the first line of Homer that came to mind. "Sing, goddess, of Achilles' rage!" The words lifted off the page like golden birds, circling around her head and chanting in harmony. The light intensified until it blazed brighter than the sun, and Maya felt herself dissolving, becoming part of the story itself. The wooden horse, the burning city, the grief and glory and rage of the ancient world. It all flowed through her and around her and into her. Then darkness, silence, the smell of her bedroom instead of smoke and blood. Maya gasped and found herself slumped over her desk, her cheek pressed against the open book. Her desk lamp still burned, casting its harsh circle of light across her notes and empty cans. The digital clock read 2:52 a.m. Only 5 minutes had passed, though she'd lived through hours in ancient Troy. She sat up slowly, her body aching as if she'd really climbed ropes and run through burning streets. The book lay open before her to the illustration of the Trojan horse, but something was different. The page felt warm under her fingers, and a faint smell of smoke seemed to cling to the paper. When she looked closely at the illustration, she could swear she saw new details that hadn't been there before. A small figure climbing a rope into the horse's belly, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. But it was the text that made her hands shake. There, at the bottom of the page in script that matched Homer's own, was a line that definitely hadn't been there when she'd started reading. The gods will always remember. Maya closed the book carefully and sat back in her chair. Her grandfather had owned this copy for decades, had read it countless times during his years as a classics professor. Had he known what it was capable of? Had he ever touched that page and found himself pulled into the story? She thought of Antenor's final words, his plea to remember Troy as it had been. Not just an ancient ruin or a literary symbol, but a real place filled with real people who had loved and hoped and died. She thought of the celebration she'd witnessed, the magnificent city in its final hours, the priest who had recognised her displacement and helped her understand her purpose. Maya opened her laptop and began to type, her fingers flying over the keys. Not her assigned essay about Achilles' wrath, but something else entirely. An account of Troy's last night, written by someone who had been there, someone who had breathed its air and walked its streets and seen its people as more than characters in an ancient story. She wrote about the music in the streets and the smell of victory wine, about the children dancing around the horse and the elderly men arguing about peace, about Antenor's intelligent eyes and his grandfather's wisdom passed down through generations, about the moment when celebration turned to horror, and how even in their final extremity, the Trojans had shown courage and dignity and love. The words poured out of her like water, carrying with them all the grief and beauty and terrible truth she had witnessed. This was why she had been sent there, not to change the story, but to remember it, to ensure that Troy's tragedy lived on not just as literature, but as memory, as testament to the real human cost of war and glory and the gods' cruel games. When she finished writing, the eastern window showed the first pale hints of dawn. Maya saved the document and looked down at the book one more time. The strange line was still there, proof that her journey had been more than just an exhaustion-induced dream. The gods will always remember, and now, so would she. Maya closed the Iliad and put it carefully back on the shelf where it belonged, but she knew she would return to it again and again, to read not just Homer's words, but the living memory of a city and its people. She'd been chosen to witness the fall of Troy, and that witness would stay with her forever. Outside her window, the modern world began another day. But in the pages of an ancient book, Troy would always burn, and a teenage girl would always climb into a wooden horse to find her way home, carrying with her the voices of the dead and the promise to remember their story truly. The gods, after all, were always watching, and they never forgot. Maya didn't go to school that day. She called in sick, her voice hoarse from what she told her mother was a sore throat, but was really the lingering echo of smoke and screams. Instead, she spent the morning researching everything she could find about Troy, about the archaeological evidence, about the real city that had inspired Homer's epic. The ruins at Hisarlik in modern Turkey seemed pale and lifeless compared to the vibrant metropolis she had walked through. Broken foundation stones and pottery shards couldn't capture the music that had filled those streets. The laughter of children, the warmth of oil lamps glowing in windows. The academic papers she read described Troy 7a as a fortified citadel destroyed by fire around 1200 BCE, possibly by enemies, possibly by earthquake. They spoke of population estimates and trade routes and ceramic typologies. None of them mentioned Antenor. Maya found herself crying as she read a particularly dry archaeological report. These scholars were trying their best to understand the past, but they were working with fragments, broken walls and scattered artifacts. They couldn't see what she had seen. The way torchlight had danced on the carved pillars, The pride in King Priam's bearing as he blessed the wooden horse, the intelligence burning in a young priest's eyes as he recognised truth that others couldn't perceive. She pulled out her phone and called her grandfather. "Maya? Sweetheart, shouldn't you be in school?" His voice was warm but concerned. Retired Professor James Chen had always been her favourite relative, the one who understood her love of stories and ancient mysteries. "Grandpa," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "That copy of the Iliad you gave me, the really old one with the illustrations, where did you get it?" There was a long pause. "That's an interesting question. Why do you ask?" "I was reading it last night and something strange happened. Maya stopped. How could she possibly explain? The book feels different from other books, special somehow. Another pause, longer this time. "Maya, can you come over? This isn't really a conversation for the phone." An hour later, Maya sat in her grandfather's cluttered study, surrounded by towers of books in dozens of languages. The old man poured tea with hands that trembled slightly, not from age, Maya realised, but from emotion. "I was wondering when this would happen," he said quietly. "When you would be old enough, ready enough. The book chooses its own time." Maya's heart hammered. You know what it does." Professor Chen nodded slowly. "I was 22 when it happened to me, a graduate student working late in the university library. I touched the page showing Hector's funeral, and," he gestured helplessly, "suddenly I was there. In Troy, but earlier in the war. I saw Hector alive, saw him with his wife Andromache and baby son Astyanax. I watched him pray at the altar of Zeus before riding out to his final battle with Achilles. How long were you there?" 3 days. I tried everything I could think of to warn him, to change the outcome. But the story was stronger than my intentions. Hector died exactly as Homer wrote, and I could only watch." The old man's eyes were distant with memory. "When I finally found my way back, I was changed. I understood that literature isn't just words on a page, it's living memory preserved across centuries." Maya leaned forward. "Where did the book come from?" "My grandfather gave it to me, just as I gave it to you. And his grandfather gave it to him, back in China before the family emigrated. The book is much older than it appears, Maya, old enough to remember when the stories it contains were still being lived." He sipped his tea thoughtfully. "We are its guardians, but also its chosen witnesses. Each generation, someone in our family is called to see what others can only read. But why us? Why our family?" Professor Chen smiled sadly. "My great-great-grandfather was a scholar in the imperial court, a man who believed that stories held the power to preserve truth across time. He encountered the book during his research into ancient texts, and it bound itself to our bloodline. We carry the responsibility of memory, Maya. We ensure that the people in these stories are remembered as human beings, not just as characters." Maya thought of Antenor's final words, his plea to remember Troy as it had been. It's not just about the famous heroes, is it? It's about everyone. Exactly. Her grandfather's eyes sharpened with pride. The epics focus on kings and warriors, but every city, every war, every tragedy contains thousands of ordinary people living ordinary lives until history sweeps them up. We witness for them. Will it happen again? The book will call to you when it needs you. Other stories, other times. I've walked the walls of Babylon, stood in Caesar's Senate, watched the Library of Alexandria burn. Each journey changes you, makes you understand that the past isn't past. It's alive, it's present, it matters. He reached across the table and took her hand. It's a heavy responsibility, Maya, but also a profound gift. Maya nodded, understanding flooding through her. The nightmares that had plagued her all day weren't just trauma. They were sacred memory, the weight of witness. She had been chosen to carry Troy's truth forward, to ensure that its people lived on in more than just academic footnotes. "There's something else," she said, and told him about the line that had appeared in the book. "The gods will always remember." Professor Chen's eyebrows rose. "That's new. In all my journeys, I never saw the book change its text." He was quiet for a long moment. Perhaps this generation's calling is different. Perhaps the stories themselves are evolving, becoming more interactive with their witnesses. Maya spent the rest of the day with her grandfather. listening to his accounts of ancient worlds made real. He showed her his journals, hundreds of pages documenting conversations with historical figures, descriptions of lost cities, accounts of pivotal moments in human history witnessed firsthand. She realised that her family wasn't just keeping academic records, they were maintaining humanity's true memory, the lived experience that no amount of archaeological excavation could recover. When she finally returned home that evening, Maya approached her copy of the Iliad with new reverence. She opened it carefully to the page showing the Trojan horse, and there was her tiny figure in the illustration, barely visible, but undeniably present. The book had accepted her into its visual record, made her part of the story itself. But as she studied the page more closely, she noticed something else. Other small figures, scattered throughout various illustrations. A young man standing at the edge of Hector's funeral scene. Her grandfather, she realised. An older figure watching from the shadows during Priam's supplication to Achilles. Perhaps her great-grandfather. The book contained a visual genealogy of her family's witnesses, each one carrying forward the memories of the dead. Maya touched the new line of text. The gods will always remember. The words felt warm under her fingertip, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. She understood now that this wasn't just a promise, it was a compact. The gods would remember, but only as long as mortals like her continued to witness, to carry the stories forward, to ensure that the truths of the past remained alive in the present. She opened her laptop and continued writing, adding to her account of Troy's last night. But now she wrote with deeper purpose, knowing that her words weren't just creative expression. They were sacred testimony, the fulfillment of an ancient covenant between the divine and human memory. She wrote about Antenor's kindness, about the children who had danced around the wooden horse, about the women in the captives' quarters who had shown her compassion despite their own fear. As she typed, Maya felt the presence of all her ancestors who had carried this burden before her. They had walked through history's darkest and brightest moments, had spoken with heroes and witnessed tragedies, had returned home carrying the voices of the dead. Now that responsibility was hers, and she would not let it rest lightly. The book sat open beside her laptop, its pages glowing softly in the lamplight. Other stories waited within its binding, other times, other places, other people whose memories needed preserving. Maya knew she would answer when they called, ready to step through the page and into the past, ready to witness and remember and carry forward the truth of human experience across the centuries. The gods were watching, and through her they would always remember. Over the following weeks, Maya found herself changed in ways both subtle and profound. She moved through her daily routine, classes, homework, hanging out with friends, but part of her remained anchored in that ancient night. The smell of smoke would sometimes catch her by surprise in the hallway between periods, or she would hear an echo of Antenor's voice in her AP literature teacher's discussions of heroic themes. Her classmates noticed nothing, but Maya felt as though she carried Troy within her chest like a second heart, beating in rhythm with memories that weren't quite her own. Mrs. Henderson assigned another essay on the Iliad, this time focusing on the role of fate versus free will in the epic. Maya stared at the prompt for a long time, thinking about her desperate attempts to change history, the sword that had crumbled in her hands, the inexorable march of events toward their tragic conclusion. She wrote about the weight of predestination, with an authority that surprised even her, drawing connections between divine will and human agency that went far deeper than typical high school analysis. "This is exceptional work, Maya," Mrs. Henderson said after class, holding up her essay. "There's a maturity to your understanding here that I rarely see. Have you been doing additional research?" "You could say that," Maya replied, thinking of the research that involved climbing into wooden horses and watching cities burn. But it was during lunch that the real test came. Maya sat with her usual group: Jessica, who was obsessed with social media, David, who lived and breathed video games, and Aidan, who considered himself an intellectual because he'd read 1984 sophomore year. They were discussing their weekend plans when Jessica mentioned a new historical drama series. "It's about ancient Rome," she said, scrolling through her phone. "Super bloody, lots of gladiators. The reviews say it's really authentic." Maya nearly choked on her sandwich. "Authentic how?" "You know, like real history stuff, not made up." Jessica shrugged. "Though honestly, all that ancient stuff feels the same to me." Just a bunch of dead people doing dead people things. The casual dismissal hit Maya like a physical blow. Dead people doing dead people things. She thought of Antenor's ink-stained fingers, of the children dancing in Troy's streets, of King Priam's dignity, even in his final moments. These weren't dead people. They were people who happened to be dead. People whose lives had mattered, whose joys and sorrows and hopes had been as real as anything her friends experienced. They weren't just dead people, Maya said quietly. They were human beings. They had families, dreams, fears. They fell in love and worried about their children and argued with their neighbours about property lines. David looked up from his phone. Whoa, Maya. It's just history class, not a personal crusade. But it is personal, Maya insisted, her voice growing stronger. Every story we read, every historical event we study, those were real people living real lives. When we dismiss them as just ancient stuff, we're erasing their humanity. Her friends exchanged glances, the look that said Maya was being weird again, too intense about schoolwork. Jessica changed the subject to the upcoming homecoming dance, and Maya let the conversation flow around her, feeling more isolated than ever. How could she explain that she'd held a dying priest's hand, that she'd seen a civilization's final hours, that she carried within her the voices of people who had been dust for 3,000 years? That evening, Maya called her grandfather again. I feel like I'm living in two worlds, she told him. The modern one where everything is disposable and nothing seems to matter, and this other one where every moment carries the weight of eternity. I don't know how to bridge them. Professor Chen was quiet for a moment. Do you remember what I told you about my first journey? How I watched Hector die? Yes. What I didn't tell you was what happened after I returned. I spent months feeling exactly like you do now, displaced, carrying memories that no one else could understand. I almost went mad trying to convince my professors that the Troy they were studying had been a living city, not just an archaeological site. Maya felt a surge of recognition. What did you do? I learned to translate, not languages, experiences. I found ways to make the ancient world accessible to modern people without betraying its truth. My doctoral thesis on the social structures of Bronze Age Anatolia won awards because I wrote about those societies as if I'd actually met their people, which of course I had. So you used your experiences in your academic work. In everything. My teaching, my writing, my way of understanding the present through the lens of the past. The gift and burden of our family is that we see history not as distant events, but as lived experience. That perspective makes us better scholars, better teachers, better human beings. Maya considered this. But what about the loneliness? Carrying all these memories that no one else shares? That never entirely goes away, her grandfather admitted, but it becomes bearable when you find your purpose. When you understand that you're not just a witness, you're a bridge. You help the living connect with the dead, the present understand the past. After hanging up, Maya sat in her room staring at the copy of the Iliad. The book seemed to pulse with potential energy, as if other stories were stirring within its pages. She opened it carefully, flipping through the familiar illustrations. There was the fall of Troy, her own tiny figure still visible climbing into the horse. But as she turned the pages, other images seemed more vivid than before. A massive wooden ship with a single square sail beached on a strange shore while armed men disembarked. Vikings, Maya realised, though the style was different from the popular depictions she'd seen in movies. These men looked travel-worn and desperate, their faces marked by months at sea, a great library with soaring columns, its shelves stretching impossibly high, filled with scrolls and codices. Scholars in white robes moved between the stacks while scribes copied manuscripts at long tables. Alexandria, she thought, though this version seemed far grander than any reconstruction she'd seen. A medieval castle under siege, its walls bristling with defenders, while a great army spread across the plain below. Banners snapped in the wind, and she could almost hear the clash of weapons, the shouts of commanders, the prayers of soldiers facing death. Each illustration seemed to whisper her name, inviting her to step through the page and witness history firsthand. Maya felt a thrill of anticipation mixed with trepidation. She was beginning to understand that her journey to Troy had been just the beginning, an initiation into a larger calling, but there was something else too. As she studied the images more closely, Maya noticed that each scene contained small anachronisms, details that didn't belong to their historical periods. In the Viking scene, one of the warriors wore what looked suspiciously like modern hiking boots. The Alexandria library had electric lights hanging impossibly from the ceiling. The medieval castle featured soldiers with what appeared to be telescopic sights on their crossbows. Maya frowned, tracing these anomalies with her finger. They felt intentional, as if the book were trying to tell her something. Then understanding dawned. These weren't just historical scenes she was seeing, but future possibilities. Other people like her, other witnesses from different time periods, had been or would be drawn into these moments. The book didn't just preserve the past, it created a network of observers across time itself. She flipped to the very back of the book, to pages she'd never examined closely before. There, in script that seemed to shift and change as she watched, were names and dates written in various hands. Chen Wei-ming, 1847, witnessed the burning of the Summer Palace, Chen Lihua, 1923 to present at the excavation of King Tut's tomb, Chen James, 1967, to observe the construction of Hadrian's Wall. Her grandfather's name was there, along with dozens of others stretching back centuries, and at the very bottom, in handwriting she recognised as her own, Chen Maya, 2025, witnessed the fall of Troy. But below that, new entries were already appearing in ghostly script. Chen Maya, 2025, present at the founding of Rome. Chen Maya, 2025, observed the burning of the Library of Alexandria. Chen Maya, 2025, witnessed the Battle of Hastings. Maya's hands trembled as she read. The book wasn't just showing her the past, it was showing her destiny. She would make more journeys, witness more pivotal moments in human history. She would become not just a guardian of memory, but an active participant in the preservation of human experience across time. A sudden knock at her bedroom door made her jump. "Maya, dinner's ready," her mother called. "Coming, Mom," Maya replied, carefully closing the book. But as she placed it back on the shelf, she noticed one final detail that made her breath catch. The spine of the book, which had always shown simply the Iliad, Homer, now displayed additional text in golden letters, the Iliad and other true histories, as witnessed by the Chen family. Maya smiled, understanding flooding through her. The book was evolving, transforming from a simple copy of Homer's epic into something far more significant, a chronicle of her family's witness to history, a record of human experience preserved across millennia. She was part of something larger than herself, a chain of observers stretching back into antiquity and forward into an unknowable future. During dinner, Maya listened to her parents discuss their day, her father's presentation at the software company, her mother's challenges with her third-grade class, normal contemporary concerns that felt both precious and ephemeral after her glimpse into the vast sweep of history. She realised that her role wasn't to choose between the ancient and modern worlds, but to help them illuminate each other. "How was school today, sweetheart?" her mother asked. "Enlightening," Maya replied, and meant it in ways her parents couldn't imagine. That night, as she prepared for bed, Maya felt the book calling to her again. Not urgently, not with the desperate pull that had drawn her to Troy, but with a gentle invitation. Other stories waited, other witnesses were needed, other truths required preservation. She wasn't ready yet. She needed time to process what she'd already experienced, to understand her role more fully. But soon, she knew, she would answer that call. The gods were indeed watching, and through her, they would always remember. But more than that, Maya realised, through her witness, the dead would always remain alive, their voices echoing across centuries, their humanity preserved in the eternal now of story and memory. She had become a keeper of souls, a guardian of the eternal human experience that connected all people across all time. Tomorrow would bring more homework, more tests, more ordinary teenage concerns. But Maya carried within her the knowledge that she was part of something timeless and sacred, a witness to history, a voice for the voiceless, a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the eternally remembered. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The fluorescent light above Marcus Chen's desk flickered with that familiar dying buzz that meant another sleepless night ahead. At 16, he'd grown accustomed to the sound. It had become the soundtrack to his late-night cramming sessions, a constant companion in his cramped bedroom where history textbooks towered like paper skyscrapers around his workspace. The digital clock on his nightstand glowed 11:47 p.m. in hostile red digits, each number a reminder that his American history exam loomed just 8 hours away. Marcus rubbed his tired eyes and stared down at the open textbook before him, its yellowed pages illuminated by the harsh desk lamp that cast everything in stark shadows. Chapter 14. The Civil War and its aftermath stretched before him like an unconquerable mountain of dates, names and battles that seemed to blur together in his exhausted mind. He'd always been drawn to history, not the sanitized version they served up in Mrs. Patterson's third period class, but the real, messy human stories that lay buried beneath layers of academic analysis and standardized test preparation. "If only I could have been there," Marcus muttered to himself, the words barely audible in the quiet house where his parents had long since gone to bed. If only I could see what it was really like instead of just memorizing when Fort Sumter was attacked, or how many casualties there were at Gettysburg. His finger traced along the page as he read about Lincoln's presidency, about the weight of a nation divided, about decisions that shaped the course of American history. The text felt cold, clinical, stripped of the passion and fear and hope that must have filled those crucial moments. He turned the page and found himself face to face with a detailed account of April 14th, 1865, the night that changed everything. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theatre was covered in meticulous detail. John Wilkes Booth's careful planning, the president's fateful decision to attend Our American Cousin, the single gunshot that echoed through the theatre box and reverberated through history. Marcus had read this section dozens of times before, but tonight something felt different. The words seemed to pulse on the page, as if they contained some hidden energy waiting to be released. As he read about Mary Todd Lincoln's laughter at the comedy just moments before tragedy struck, Marcus felt a familiar frustration building in his chest. How could no one have seen it coming? How could security have been so lax? How could they have let Booth, a known Confederate sympathizer, get so close to the president? The questions swirled in his mind like autumn leaves caught in a whirlwind, each one leading to another, until he felt dizzy with the weight of historical hindsight. The textbook described Booth's movements that night with clinical precision. His arrival at the theatre around 10 o'clock, his familiarity with the building's layout from his days as a performer, his knowledge of the play's timing that allowed him to time his attack with the loudest laugh from the audience. Marcus found himself imagining the scene. The gaslit theatre, the rustle of silk dresses, the murmur of an audience enjoying an evening's entertainment, completely unaware that they were about to witness one of history's most consequential crimes. His eyes grew heavy as he read about the aftermath. Lincoln's death the following morning, the manhunt for Booth, the nation's descent into grief and confusion. The words began to swim before his vision, letters rearranging themselves in patterns that seemed almost alive. Marcus blinked hard, trying to focus, but the ink appeared to be moving, shifting like liquid mercury across the page. He rubbed his eyes again, convinced that exhaustion was playing tricks on him, but when he looked back at the textbook, the phenomenon had only intensified. The black ink was definitely moving now, flowing in slow, hypnotic spirals that seemed to draw his gaze deeper into the page. The words about Lincoln's assassination began to glow with a strange warm light, as if illuminated from within. Marcus reached out tentatively to touch the page, wondering if he was having some kind of breakdown from too much caffeine and too little sleep. But as his fingertip made contact with the paper, he felt a sudden electric shock that shot up his arm and through his entire body. The room around him began to spin, or maybe he was spinning. It was impossible to tell. The familiar walls of his bedroom blurred into streaks of colour, and the textbook seemed to expand beneath his hands, growing larger and larger until the pages surrounded him like the walls of a paper canyon. The words floated up from the surface, swirling around him in a tornado of dates and names and historical facts, and Marcus felt himself falling, tumbling through layers of text and time, as if the very fabric of reality had torn open and swallowed him whole. He fell through darkness punctuated by flashes of images, soldiers marching, cannons firing, politicians arguing in gaslit chambers, all of it rushing past him at impossible speed. The sensation was like drowning in history itself, being pulled down into the depths of time by currents too strong to resist. Marcus tried to call out, but no sound came from his throat, and he wondered if this was what dying felt like, this dissolution into the past, this merging with the stories he'd spent so many nights reading about. Then suddenly, the falling stopped. Marcus hit something solid with a bone-jarring impact that knocked the wind from his lungs and sent stars exploding across his vision. He lay there for several moments, gasping and disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Slowly his senses began to return, and he realised he was no longer in his bedroom. The surface beneath him was rough cobblestone, slick with moisture and scattered with debris. The air smelled different, heavier, laden with wood smoke and horse manure and something else he couldn't identify. Marcus pushed himself up on shaking arms and looked around. He was lying in a narrow alley between two brick buildings, their walls blackened with soot and age. Gas lamps flickered at the mouth of the alley, casting dancing shadows that seemed to reach for him with grasping fingers. The sound of horses' hooves and wooden wheels on stone echoed from somewhere nearby, along with the murmur of distant voices and the occasional bark of a dog. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream, or a hallucination brought on by too much studying and too little sleep. But as Marcus climbed unsteadily to his feet, every sensation felt startlingly vivid. The cold bite of the night air against his skin, the rough texture of the brick wall against his palm, the acrid smell of burning coal that made his eyes water. If this was a dream, it was the most realistic one he'd ever experienced. He stumbled toward the mouth of the alley and peered out into what appeared to be a 19th century street scene. Gas lamps lined the thoroughfare, their warm glow illuminating a world that looked like it had stepped directly out of his history textbook. Horse-drawn carriages clattered past, their drivers bundled in heavy coats against the chill. Men in dark suits and top hats walked briskly along the sidewalks, while women in long skirts and bonnets hurried past with packages tucked under their arms. Marcus looked down at himself and immediately understood why several passers-by had turned to stare. His modern clothes, a faded Star Wars t-shirt ripped at jeans and beat-up sneakers, stood out like neon signs in this gaslit world. A man in a beaver fur hat actually stopped walking and pointed at him, saying something to his companion in a voice too low to hear. Marcus quickly ducked back into the shadows of the alley, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror. Where was he? More importantly, when was he? The architecture, the clothing, the very feel of the air all suggested the mid-19th century, but that was impossible. People didn't just fall through textbooks and land in the past. Things like that happened in science fiction movies, not to 16-year-old high school students cramming for history exams. But as impossible as it seemed, Marcus couldn't deny the evidence of his senses. This place felt real in ways that dreams never did. He could feel the cold seeping through his thin t-shirt, could smell the complex mixture of coal smoke and human activity that permeated the air, could hear the authentic sounds of a city powered by horses and heated by fire. If this was a hallucination, it was the most complete and convincing one in medical history. He needed clothing, proper clothing that would allow him to move through this world without attracting attention. Marcus crept deeper into the alley system behind the buildings, looking for any opportunity to acquire period-appropriate garments. His modern sensibilities rebelled at the idea of stealing, but his survival instincts overrode his moral qualms. If he was really in the 19th century, standing out as a strangely dressed outsider could be dangerous in ways he couldn't even imagine. After nearly an hour of searching, Marcus found what he needed hanging from a clothesline behind a modest boarding house. The garments were still damp from washing, but they appeared to be roughly his size: dark wool trousers, a white cotton shirt, a simple vest, and a coat that had seen better days but would serve his purposes. He felt like a thief as he untied the clothes from the line, but he promised himself he would find a way to repay the owner if he ever figured out how to return to his own time. Changing clothes in the darkness of the alley was an awkward, fumbling process, made more difficult by his shaking hands and the unfamiliar fastenings and cuts of 19th century clothing. The trousers were looser than modern pants, but shorter, ending well above his ankles. The shirt collar felt stiff and uncomfortable, and the vest was tight across his chest. But when he finally emerged from the alley wearing his borrowed costume, he found that he attracted far less attention from passing pedestrians. Now came the crucial question. What date was it? Marcus needed to know exactly where and when he had landed if he hoped to make any sense of his situation. He approached a newspaper vendor on the corner, a grizzled man in a threadbare coat who was calling out headlines to the passing crowd. Evening paper, latest news from the Capitol, President Lincoln to attend the theatre tonight. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. Lincoln at the theatre could only mean one thing. Ford's Theatre, April 14th, 1865, the night that would live in infamy as one of the darkest moments in American history. He fumbled in his pockets for money, but of course his modern currency would be useless here. The newspaper vendor looked at him expectantly, and Marcus realised he had no way to purchase the paper that would confirm his worst fears. "What's the date?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice casual despite the panic rising in his throat. The vendor squinted at him suspiciously. "You feeling all right, son? It's April 14th, year of our Lord, 1865. Now, you buying a paper or not? April 14th, 1865. The date hit Marcus like a physical blow, and he staggered backward, his mind reeling with the implications. He was here, in Washington, D.C., on the very night that John Wilkes Booth would assassinate Abraham Lincoln. He was living through one of the most pivotal moments in American history, but unlike everyone around him, he knew exactly what was going to happen. The knowledge felt like a lead weight in his stomach. In just a few hours, the president would arrive at Ford's Theatre to watch Our American Cousin. He would settle into his box with Mary Todd Lincoln and their guests, enjoying a rare evening of relaxation after the long years of civil war, and then, at approximately 10:15 p.m, John Wilkes Booth would slip into the presidential box and fire a single shot that would change the course of history. Marcus walked through the gaslit streets in a daze, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of his situation. All around him, people went about their evening routines with no idea that their world was about to be shattered. He passed couples strolling arm in arm, children playing in the lamplight, men discussing business outside a tavern, normal people living normal lives, blissfully unaware that their president had only hours left to live. The weight of his knowledge was almost unbearable. Marcus knew things that no one else in this time period could possibly know, not just the fact of the assassination, but the precise details of how it would unfold. He knew that Booth had been planning this for weeks, that he had co-conspirators positioned throughout the city, that the attack on Lincoln was part of a larger plot to decapitate the Union government. He knew that Major Henry Rathbone would be wounded trying to stop Booth, that doctor. Charles Leal would be the first physician to reach the dying president, that Lincoln would linger through the night before dying at 7:22 the following morning. But what was he supposed to do with this knowledge? The rational part of his mind insisted that he couldn't possibly change history, that the events of April 14th, 1865 were fixed points in time that couldn't be altered. But another part of him, the part that had always been frustrated by the passive nature of studying history, whispered that maybe he could make a difference. Maybe his impossible journey through time had happened for a reason. Maybe he was meant to save Abraham Lincoln. The idea was terrifying in its implications. If he somehow managed to prevent the assassination, what would happen to history? Would the Reconstruction period unfold differently? Would the course of American development change in ways he couldn't predict or control? And perhaps most frightening of all, would he be able to return to his own time, or would changing history trap him forever in this gaslit world of horses and handheld lamps? Marcus found himself walking toward Ford's Theatre, almost without conscious decision, drawn by a mixture of morbid fascination and desperate hope. The building loomed before him in the gaslight, its facade decorated with patriotic bunting in preparation for the president's visit. People were already gathering outside, dressed in their finest clothes for an evening of entertainment. They had no idea they were assembling to witness a tragedy. He tried to approach the theatre entrance, thinking perhaps he could warn the security guards or get a message to someone in authority, but his modern mannerisms and nervous demeanour immediately attracted the wrong kind of attention. A uniformed guard stepped forward to block his path. "State your business, young man," the guard said, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. "You seem mighty agitated about something." Marcus realised too late that his obvious anxiety and strange behaviour were making him look suspicious. In a time of war, with the president scheduled to attend a public event, the authorities would be on high alert for potential threats. His knowledge of the impending assassination, instead of making him a valuable ally, was making him appear to be a possible conspirator. "I just wanted to see the play," Marcus stammered, but even to his own ears the lie sounded unconvincing. "I heard the president might be attending tonight." The guard's eyes narrowed. "Mighty interested in the president's whereabouts, aren't you? And those clothes of yours don't look quite right. Where do you say you were from?" Marcus backed away slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could see suspicion crystallizing in the guard's expression, could practically watch the man's mental gears turning as he tried to decide whether this nervous young stranger represented a threat. In just a few moments, the guard would likely decide that Marcus needed to be detained for questioning, and any chance of preventing the assassination would be lost. "I have to go," Marcus said, continuing to back away from the theatre entrance. "I just remembered I have somewhere else to be." But the guard was already reaching for his whistle, preparing to summon additional security. Marcus turned and ran, plunging into the crowd of evening pedestrians and hoping to lose himself in the maze of Washington's side streets. Behind him, he could hear the shrill blast of the whistle and shouted commands to stop the suspicious young man. Marcus ran through the gaslit streets like a man possessed, his borrowed clothes flapping around him as he dodged between carriages and leaped over obstacles. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind him. Running feet shouted orders, the occasional blast of a whistle. He ducked down alleys and through courtyards, using every trick he could think of to evade capture. But always in the back of his mind was the terrible knowledge that, while he was running for his freedom, time was running out for Abraham Lincoln. The chase continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Marcus's modern sneakers, hidden beneath his period trousers, gave him an advantage in speed and maneuverability, but the pursuing guards knew the city far better than he did. Several times he thought he had lost them, only to hear the sound of approaching footsteps just as he was beginning to catch his breath. Finally, gasping and exhausted, Marcus found himself in a narrow alley behind a row of shops, pressed against a brick wall and listening to the sounds of his pursuers searching nearby streets. His mind raced as he tried to think of another approach. Direct confrontation had failed. His attempt to warn the authorities had only made him a suspect, but there had to be another way, some method of preventing the assassination that wouldn't require him to convince skeptical strangers of his impossible knowledge. As he stood there in the shadows, catching his breath and trying to plan his next move, Marcus heard the distant sound of a church bell tolling the hour, 9 o'clock. In just over an hour, Abraham Lincoln would arrive at Ford's Theatre. In an hour and 15 minutes, John Wilkes Booth would fire the shot that would echo through history. Time was running out, and Marcus was no closer to finding a way to change the course of events. But then a new idea began to form in his mind, born of desperation, and the kind of reckless courage that only comes from having nothing left to lose. If he couldn't warn the authorities, if he couldn't convince anyone to take his knowledge seriously, then maybe he needed to approach the problem from a different angle. Maybe instead of trying to prevent Booth from reaching Lincoln, he needed to focus on disrupting the assassination attempt itself. Marcus had read extensively about the events at Ford's Theatre that night. He knew that Booth had timed his attack to coincide with one of the loudest laughs in the play, knowing that the sound would help mask the gunshot. He knew that the actor had used his familiarity with the theatre's layout to position himself perfectly for both the attack and his escape. Most importantly, he knew that Booth's success had depended on the element of surprise, on catching everyone in the presidential box off guard. What if that element of surprise could be eliminated? What if, at the crucial moment, someone shouted a warning? The chaos that would result might be enough to save Lincoln's life, even if it couldn't prevent all harm from coming to him. The plan was desperate and dangerous, with 1,000 ways it could go wrong. Marcus would have to somehow get inside Ford's Theatre despite the heightened security, position himself where he could see Booth making his approach, and then create enough of a disturbance at exactly the right moment to disrupt the assassination. Even if everything went perfectly, he would almost certainly be arrested, possibly injured, and quite possibly blamed for being part of the plot himself. But as Marcus crouched in that dark alley, listening to the sounds of a 19th century city going about its evening business, he realised he had no choice. He had been given an impossible gift, knowledge of a tragedy before it occurred, and the chance to prevent it. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but it was also clarifying. Whatever the personal cost, he had to try. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of careful planning and desperate improvisation. Marcus used his knowledge of the theatre's layout, gleaned from years of reading about the assassination to identify possible entry points. He observed the patterns of the security guards, looking for gaps in their coverage. He studied the timing of the play, trying to calculate exactly when Booth would make his move. As the hour approached 10 o'clock, Marcus found himself crouched behind a pile of scenery in a storage area behind Ford's Theatre. Getting inside had been easier than he'd expected. The building was old and had multiple entrances that weren't all equally well guarded. The staff was focused on preparing for the president's arrival, and a determined young man in period clothing could slip through the cracks if he was careful and patient. From his hiding place, Marcus could hear the sounds of the audience taking their seats, the rustle of programs and the murmur of excited conversation. Somewhere out there, Abraham Lincoln was settling into his box with Mary Todd Lincoln and their guests, preparing to enjoy a few hours of entertainment after the long years of war and responsibility. The president had no idea that death was stalking him through the corridors of the theatre, that his assassin was even now making final preparations for the attack. Marcus checked his pocket watch, a timepiece he had lifted from a distracted gentleman earlier in the evening, another crime added to his growing list of moral compromises. 10:10 p.m. Just 5 minutes until Booth would make his entrance into the presidential box. 5 minutes to summon the courage for what he was about to do. The sounds from the stage indicated that our American cousin was approaching the scene where Booth would strike. Marcus had read the accounts so many times that he could practically recite the dialogue from memory. In just a few moments, actor Harry Hawke would deliver the line that always got the biggest laugh from the audience. "Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sock-dologizing old man-trap." The audience would erupt in laughter, and in that moment of noise and distraction, Booth would fire his fatal shot, unless Marcus could prevent it. He crept forward through the backstage area, using the shadows and stored equipment to conceal his movement. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone in the theatre could hear it, but he forced himself to keep moving. Through a gap in the curtains he could see into the theatre itself, the stage brightly lit by calcium lights, the audience packed into every available seat, and there, in the presidential box draped with American flags, the distinctive profile of Abraham Lincoln himself. It was shocking to see the president in person, even from a distance. All the photographs and paintings Marcus had studied couldn't capture the reality of Lincoln's physical presence, his unusual height, the way he carried himself, the sense of weariness and determination that seemed to emanate from him, even during a moment of relaxation. This was the man who had held the nation together through its greatest crisis, who had proclaimed the emancipation of enslaved people, who had delivered the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural Address. This was one of the most important figures in American history, and in just minutes he would be murdered unless Marcus could find the courage to act. Movement in the shadows caught Marcus's eye, and he felt his breath catch in his throat. There, moving silently through the backstage area with the confidence of someone who belonged there, was John Wilkes Booth. Even in the dim light, the actor was unmistakable. His handsome features, his theatrical bearing, the way he moved with the fluid grace of someone trained for the stage. He was dressed impeccably in dark clothing, and in his right hand Marcus could see the glint of metal that must be the single-shot Derringer pistol that would change history. This was it. The moment Marcus had been preparing for, the collision between past and future that would determine not just the fate of Abraham Lincoln, but possibly the entire course of American history. Marcus felt frozen with the magnitude of what was about to happen, paralysed by the weight of responsibility and the terror of potentially making everything worse. But then he thought of all the history books he had read, all the accounts of the grief and chaos that followed Lincoln's death, all the speculation about what might have been different if the president had lived to guide Reconstruction. He thought of the countless lives that might be saved, the suffering that might be prevented, the different path American history might take if this one moment could be changed. Marcus stepped out of the shadows. The stage below erupted in laughter as Harry Hawke delivered his famous line, and in that instant, Marcus saw Booth raise his pistol and step toward the door of the presidential box. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, each second stretching into an eternity as Marcus watched the most famous assassination in American history begin to unfold before his eyes. "Stop!" Marcus shouted at the top of his lungs, his voice cutting through the laughter like a knife. "He's got a gun! Stop him!" The effect was instantaneous and electric. The laughter died as if cut off by a switch, and every head in the theatre turned to locate the source of the disruption. Booth spun around, his carefully planned attack thrown into chaos by the unexpected warning. For a moment that seemed to last forever, assassin and time traveller stared at each other across the dimly lit backstage area, and Marcus saw surprise and rage flicker across the actor's handsome features. Then chaos erupted. Security guards rushed toward the commotion, audience members screamed and pointed, and Booth, realizing that his carefully orchestrated plan had been destroyed, turned and fled through the theatre's corridors. Marcus found himself swept up in the pandemonium, pushed and shoved by panicking crowd members and grasping security personnel who weren't sure if he was hero or villain. Through the confusion, Marcus caught a glimpse of the presidential box where Abraham Lincoln was being hustled to safety by his guards. Very much alive and very much confused about what had just happened, the sight sent a surge of triumph through Marcus's chest. He had done it. Against all odds, against the flow of history itself, he had saved the 16th President of the United States. But the celebration was short-lived. Strong hands grabbed Marcus from behind, and he found himself pressed against a wall by security guards who were shouting questions he could barely understand over the noise of the panicking crowd. The theatre had erupted into complete chaos, with people pushing toward the exits and police trying to restore order. In the confusion, Marcus felt a strange sensation, as if the very air around him was beginning to shimmer and blur. The gas flames in the theatre's lamps began to flicker in an unnatural pattern, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The shadows reached for Marcus like grasping fingers, and he felt the same electric sensation he had experienced when touching his textbook back in his own time. The familiar feeling of falling returned, and the theatre around him began to spin and blur until the 19th century world dissolved into streams of colour and sound. Marcus fell through time and space, tumbling through layers of history like leaves falling through autumn air. Images flashed past him. The relieved face of Mary Todd Lincoln, newspaper headlines announcing the failed assassination attempt, Booth's capture in a Washington alley, the celebration in the streets as news spread that the president had survived. The visions swirled around him like fragments of a broken mirror, each reflecting a different aspect of the changed timeline he had created. As he sat in that classroom listening to Mrs. Patterson describe a version of Reconstruction that felt both familiar and foreign, Marcus realized that his relationship with history had been forever changed. He was no longer just a student reading about the past. He was someone who had reached across time itself to change the course of events. The knowledge was both exhilarating and terrifying, a reminder that individual actions could have consequences that echoed through the decades and centuries. The bell rang, signalling the end of class, and Marcus gathered his books with shaking hands. As he walked through the hallways of his high school, surrounded by classmates who had no idea that their world had been fundamentally altered by the actions of one 16-year-old boy, he felt the weight of his secret like a physical burden. He alone remembered the original timeline, the version of history where Lincoln had died and everything had been different. But perhaps that was as it should be. Perhaps the knowledge that history could be changed, that individual actions mattered more than anyone realized, was exactly the lesson Marcus needed to learn. As he made his way to his next class, he found himself looking at the world with new eyes, seeing not just what was, but what could be, and understanding that sometimes the most important changes began with a single voice shouting a warning in the darkness. The textbook in his backpack felt heavier than usual, weighted down not just with facts and dates, but with the knowledge of what was possible when someone cared enough to act. And in the margin of page 247, a small ink blot shaped like a candle flame served as a permanent reminder that some stories were too important to remain unchanged, and that sometimes, just sometimes, one person really could make all the difference. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy.